There is a kind of soldier history tends to misplace. Not the generals whose names are carved into monuments, and not the privates whose stories fill the paperbacks of every airport bookshop. Somewhere between those two extremes, there exists a third category. The man who was always there, always in the room, always in the dust, always at the shoulder of greatness, and yet whose own name rarely appears above the fold. This is the story of one of those men. His name was Fritz Bayerlein. He was born in a Bavarian city on the 14th of January, 1899, and he died in that same city, Würzburg, on the 30th of January 1970. 71 years. A complete life by most measurements. But between that birth and that death, he moved across a century of catastrophe in a way that no single biography has ever quite captured in full. He fought on the Western Front of the First World War as a teenager. He marched into Poland at the side of Heinz Guderian when the Second World War was only hours old. He stood at Erwin Rommel's shoulder in the desert heat of North Africa when the Afrika Korps was the most feared formation on Earth. And he was still fighting, still commanding, still making decisions. When the last great German offensive of the war collapsed in the frozen forests of the Ardennes in the winter of 1944. If you follow that career from beginning to end, what you get is not just one man's story. What you get is a guided tour of the entire arc of the Second World War, seen from the German side, filtered through the eyes of someone who was neither a fanatic nor a coward, neither a war criminal nor a saint, but something far more difficult to categorize. A professional soldier who was exceptionally good at his work, who served under two of the most studied commanders in modern military history, who led Germany's most powerful armored division into its most catastrophic defeat, and who ultimately, in a moment of moral clarity that could have gotten him shot, chose the lives of his men over an order to fight to the last. That choice, made in April of 1945, in the shattered industrial ruins of the Ruhr, is the quiet ending of a long, loud story. And it is the reason this documentary exists. So settle in. This is a long one. We are going to go all the way back, to Bavaria before the guns, to the mud of the Western Front, to the desert, the Soviet steppe, the hedgerows of Normandy, and the snow-covered roads outside a small Belgian town called Bastogne. We will take our time. We will get the details right. And somewhere along the way, you are going to understand why Fritz Bayerlein mattered, and why, for decades, history almost forgot to tell you so. Chapter 1. The boy from Würzburg sits in the valley of the main river, in the Franconian wine country of northern Bavaria, and in the year 1899, it was a city of bridges and baroque facades, of old university buildings and church towers, of a world that believed, as most of Europe believed, that the great conflicts of history were behind it. The German Empire was 30 years old. The century was turning. The idea that within 15 years, that same city would be sending its youngest sons to die in the mud of Flanders was simply unthinkable. Fritz Hermann Michael Bayerlein was born into this city in the first month of that last year before the new century. We do not know a great deal about his childhood in the detail that historians sometimes wish for. The Spade biography, the most comprehensive account of his life, notes that he was not from the traditional officer class, which in the rigidly hierarchical German military world of that era was a meaningful fact. He did not come from a family of generals. He was not the product of a Prussian military tradition stretching back through generations of iron-spined ancestors. He was, in the most honest sense of the phrase, a man who made himself. That matters. It explains something about how he survived and how he thought and why the soldiers who served under him in Africa, in Russia, in France, described him in terms that were less about authority and more about credibility. He had earned his rank, and the people around him knew it. When the First World War began, in the summer of 1914, Fritz Bayerlein was 15 years old enough to understand what was happening, young enough to be left watching from the schoolyard. While older men marched to the trains, those years of waiting, watching the war grind through its seasons, watching the casualty lists grow, watching the initial enthusiasm curdle into something grimmer and more permanent, shaped an entire generation of young Germans in ways that are difficult to fully account for. By the time Bayerlein was old enough to serve, the war was not the adventure his older classmates had once imagined. It was an industrial process for the destruction of young men, and he entered it with his eyes open. On the 5th of June, 1917, at the age of 18, Fritz Bayerlein joined the Bavarian army as a Fahnenjunker, an officer cadet enlisting in the 9th Royal Bavarian Infantry Regiment in Augsburg. The regiment was known locally by a colloquial name, the Neuner Regiment, and it was one of those units with a long enough history that the barracks walls were lined with portraits of men who had carried the same colours in earlier wars. Bayerlein was not yet an officer when he arrived. He was a cadet, a trainee, learning the basic grammar of military life at a point in the war when the German army was running low on almost everything except the willingness to keep fighting. He did not reach the Western Front until the late spring of 1918, by which point the war had entered its final and, in many ways, its most brutal phase, the Great German Spring Offensive of that year. The Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle, had briefly punched enormous holes in the Allied lines before running out of momentum, supplies, and men. By the time Bayerlein arrived at the front, Germany was on the defensive, fighting a rearguard action against Allied forces that were growing stronger by the week, as American troops poured into France in numbers that no German planner had adequately calculated. He served in the 7th Company, and in August of 1918, he was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class after his company held off a British attack using machine gun fire at a moment when their position was on the verge of being overrun. The very next day, a grenade fragment wounded him, and he was sent home to Wobelsburg to recover. He never returned to the front. The armistice was signed in November of 1918, and the war was over. He was 19 years old. He had been a soldier for barely more than a year. He had been wounded, he had been decorated, and he had seen enough of what industrialized warfare looked like at close range that any romantic notions about the glory of battle, if he had ever held any, would have been thoroughly dismantled by then. What he had learned in those few compressed months at the front was something more valuable and more durable than glory. The mechanics of staying alive, and the difference between a decision made in time and a decision made too late. The Germany that Bayerlein returned to in late 1918 was not the Germany he had left. The Kaiser had abdicated. The empire had dissolved. Revolution was unfolding in the streets of Berlin, Munich, and half a dozen other cities. The sense of collapse was total, political, economic, psychological. For a young soldier with a recently awarded Iron Cross and no civilian profession to return to, the post-war chaos presented a very specific kind of problem. What do you do now? His answer, characteristically, was to stay in uniform. After a brief period in one of the volunteer Freikorps units that were springing up across Germany in the disorder of the post-war months, Bayerlein was accepted into the 100,000-man Reichswehr, the tiny professional army that the Treaty of Versailles permitted Germany to maintain. It was a remarkable institution in its own right, an army so small that it could not fight a serious war, but so carefully curated that it became, in effect, a school for future commanders. Every man trained to perform far above his nominal rank. In 1921, Bayerlein was formally commissioned as a lieutenant in the 21st Bavarian Infantry Regiment. He was 22 years old. The rank was modest. The opportunity, though he could not have known it yet, was immense. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Bayerlein rose steadily through the Reichswehr, and then through its successor, the Wehrmacht. He was sent for general staff training, the most demanding and selective educational track in the German military system, producing the operational planners and chiefs of staff who made German armies function. He was attached to armoured units at a moment when Germany's investment in mechanized warfare was accelerating rapidly, and where the theoretical work of men like Guderian was being translated into actual tanks, actual formations, actual doctrine. By the 1st of April, 1939, with the European situation already lurching toward catastrophe, Bayerlein was appointed as a first general staff officer attached to a formation preparing for what everyone in uniform already knew was coming. He had spent 20 years becoming exactly the kind of officer the new German army needed. In September of 1939, he was about to find out whether that preparation was worth anything. Chapter 2: The Schooling of a Staff Officer, Poland and France. The invasion of Poland began in the early hours of the 1st of September, 1939, and it did not look like previous wars. It was not a slow mobilization of mass armies, followed by weeks of maneuvering and a cautious engagement at a predetermined front. It was fast, brutally disorienting fast. The German operational concept, which would later acquire the shorthand label Blitzkrieg, a word the German High Command itself rarely used, was built around the principle of shock and continuous momentum. Strike before the enemy can organize, keep striking before they can recover, and never allow the front to stabilize into a static line. Fritz Bayerlein experienced this not as a theoretical exercise, but as a practical education in real time, because the commander he was serving under, General Heinz Guderian, was one of the principal architects of the entire concept. Guderian was opinionated, aggressive, frequently in conflict with more conservative superiors, and absolutely certain that armoured formations used boldly could transform the character of modern war. Bayerlein, as his first general staff officer, was the man responsible for translating Guderian's operational intentions into orders that could actually be executed, coordinating logistics and communications, keeping the machine running while the commander pushed forward. It was the kind of work that required a particular combination of intelligence, stamina, and the ability to function under pressure without losing track of detail. What Bayerlein absorbed in Poland was the rhythm of this new kind of warfare. The way information had to flow faster than in any previous conflict, the way decisions that in an earlier generation might have been made over 24 hours, now had to be made in 2, the way the entire premise of the operation depended on keeping the enemy off balance so completely that they never had time to think clearly. The Polish campaign lasted barely 5 weeks. It ended with a German and Soviet division of the country that was brutal in its completeness. For the officers involved, it was a proof of concept, a demonstration that the doctrine worked, at least against an opponent who lacked the equipment and the time to respond. The following year brought France, and France was a far more serious test. The French army in 1940 was not the Polish army. It was one of the largest and most heavily equipped forces in Europe. supported by the British Expeditionary Force, entrenched behind the famous Maginot Line and occupying prepared defensive positions. The conventional military wisdom, shared by most analysts outside Germany and by many within it, was that any German offensive in the West would settle into the kind of grinding, attritional struggle that had defined the previous war. The French expected this. The British expected this, in a meaningful sense. Part of the German High Command expected it too. Guderian did not expect it, and the operational plan that emerged from the discussions of the winter of 1939 to 1940, pushing the main armoured thrust through the Ardennes forest, which conventional wisdom held to be impassable for large armoured formations, was in many ways Guderian's idea given strategic form. Bayerlein was once again at the nerve centre of this operation as it unfolded, working through the days and nights of May and June of 1940, as Guderian's Panzer Corps drove west, with a speed that stunned the Allied commanders and, reportedly, alarmed even some German generals who thought the advance was moving recklessly far ahead of its supporting infantry. The famous Halt Order, which paused German armour outside Dunkirk and allowed the British Expeditionary Force to evacuate, came from above, not from Guderian or his staff. And it was the kind of decision that men like Bayerlein, watching from the operations room, struggled to understand at the time. France fell in 6 weeks. It was one of the most rapid and complete military collapses in the history of European warfare, and it validated everything that Guderian had argued for years about the decisive power of concentrated armour used with nerve and speed. For Bayerlein, the France campaign was not just a military victory, it was a finishing school. He had now seen the doctrine applied at the operational level in 2 major campaigns, under one of its most gifted and demanding practitioners, against opponents with radically different capabilities. He had learned how a modern army's nerve system works, and where its weaknesses live. He had learned how staff work either enables or constrains what commanders can achieve, and he had accumulated the kind of operational experience that no training course, however rigorous, can replicate. In 1941, the same cycle continued east, into the Soviet Union, as Bayerlein followed Guderian's formation, now redesignated as Panzer Group II, into the opening of Operation Barbarossa. The Eastern Front, in its initial phase, produced victories on a scale that made Poland and France look modest. Enormous encirclements, hundreds of thousands of prisoners, advances of distances that strained comprehension. But the Eastern Front also introduced, for those paying attention, a different set of pressures. The sheer scale of the geography, the condition of the roads, the ferocity of Soviet resistance that refused to follow the script, and the slow, uncomfortable realization that the campaign would not be over before winter. Bayerlein spent the summer and autumn of 1941 inside that machine. He processed the logistics, drafted the orders, absorbed the lessons, and then, in the autumn of that year, came orders that would redirect his career entirely. He was being transferred, not east, south, across the Mediterranean, into the desert. He was going to North Africa to join a formation whose commander's name was already known to both sides of the war, a general who led from the front, who drove his staff as hard as he drove his enemies, and who had made a quiet corner of Libya into the most discussed battlefield on earth. He was going to join Erwin Rommel. Chapter 3. Into the Desert, the Afrika Korps, the North African Campaign, when you study it at any length, has a quality that distinguishes it from almost every other theatre of the Second World War. The historians debate this, and it is worth noting the debate honestly. There is a tendency in popular accounts to aestheticize the Desert War, to treat it as a kind of clean contest between professionals operating free of the worst ugliness of the wider conflict, a chivalric exception in an otherwise total war. That image is misleading in important ways. The suffering of troops on both sides was real and grinding, and the strategic stakes were anything but abstract. But there is something to the observation that the desert environment imposed its own discipline on the fighting. There were few civilians in the deep desert. The front moved in both directions with a fluidity that made the Western Front of the previous war look like a geological formation. Bayerlein arrived in North Africa in October of 1941, assigned to the Afrika Korps as its chief of staff. Rommel had been in North Africa since February of that year, and in those months, he had already established both his reputation and his method. He was not a traditional army commander in the sense of directing operations from a distant headquarters. He was almost constitutionally incapable of staying behind. He went forward. He appeared at crisis points. He made decisions on the spot, rather than waiting for information to travel back through channels and orders to travel forward again. This method produced results, remarkable results. Results that left the British command frequently reactive and confused. But it also created challenges for the staff officers who were supposed to maintain coordination and communication across a fluid front. Bayerlein's role as chief of staff was, in practical terms, to be the man who kept the operational picture coherent when Rommel was physically absent from headquarters. That meant absorbing information from across the front, synthesizing it into a picture the commander could act on, and keeping the supply lines and unit communications functioning well enough that Rommel's boldness could be translated into actual effect on the ground. It was demanding work under any circumstances. In the desert, with supply chains that stretched back across the Mediterranean, with Allied air power interdicting shipping, with the relentless physical stress of operating in extreme heat, with inadequate water and food, it was extraordinary work. The Desert War in this period was a campaign of reversals. Rommel advanced. The British recovered and counterattacked. Rommel retreated and then struck again. The front moved across the same ground multiple times, through names that became famous for readers of wartime newspapers: Tobruk, Gazala, Bir Hakim, El Alamein. Through all of it, Bayerlein was at the operational center, and his relationship with Rommel developed into something more than the typical commander-staff dynamic. There was genuine mutual respect, earned through the particular intimacy of prolonged crisis. Rommel trusted his chief of staff. Bayerlein understood his commander's thought process well enough to anticipate decisions before they were formally made. In the summer of 1942, the campaign reached its most dramatic phase. Rommel's forces drove east across Libya and into Egypt itself, reaching the railway halt of El Alamein, roughly 100 kilometers west of Alexandria. It was the high water mark of the entire North African campaign, a moment when it seemed, to those inside the German lines, that Cairo and the Suez Canal were within reach. Bayerlein was there, managing the operational details of a headquarters that was operating at the outer edge of its logistical limits. The supply situation was critical. Every tank, every liter of fuel, every artillery shell that reached the front had to cross the Mediterranean under threat from Allied aircraft and submarines. And in this period, the losses at sea were severe. Then came Alam Halfa in late August of 1942, and with it, the beginning of the turn. General Walther Neyring, commanding the Afrika Korps, was wounded in the fighting on the 30th of August, and Bayerlein briefly, and by necessity, took over command of the corps. He was not yet a general in rank, but he was the man on the spot with the operational knowledge to hold things together. That kind of improvised command is revealing. It tells you something about where the real institutional knowledge of a formation lives. Not always in the formally designated commander, but in the man who has spent months running the operations room and who knows exactly what each unit has, what it has lost, and what it can still do. The Battle of El Alamein, fought in late October and early November of 1942, ended in German defeat. It was not simply a tactical setback. It was the beginning of the end for Axis power in North Africa. Rommel's forces began the long retreat westward, back across the ground they had taken, and this time there would be no recovery, no reversal of the kind that had marked the earlier phases of the campaign. The operational mathematics had changed. Allied material superiority was now too great, and the supply situation for the Axis was too broken to permit another reversal. When the German commander, General Wilhelm von Thoma, was captured at El Alamein on the 4th of November, Bayerlein once again stepped into command during the retreat. The second time, in a matter of weeks, that he had held together a formation whose leader had been removed by battle. He managed that retreat with professionalism. The forces that pulled back from El Alamein were not routed. They maintained cohesion. They conducted a fighting withdrawal over more than 2,000 kilometers, delaying and slowing the Allied pursuit where they could, conserving what combat power remained. Bayerlein was doing this while suffering personally. He had developed muscular rheumatism and hepatitis, both of which were debilitating in an environment that offered minimal medical support. He continued working. That stubbornness, the refusal to leave the operational picture, even when physically failing, is one of the details that recurs in accounts of his character from people who served alongside him. He was not the kind of man who could delegate and rest. The work mattered too much, and the cost of inattention was too high. By the spring of 1943, the campaign in North Africa was approaching its final chapter. Allied forces under General Dwight Eisenhower had landed in Morocco and Algeria in November of 1942, as Operation Torch opened a second front that caught Axis forces in a widening strategic vice. Rommel himself was gone, invalided out of Africa in March of 1943, never to return. Bayerlein, sick and exhausted, was ordered out of Africa shortly before the final German and Italian surrender in Tunisia in May of 1943. He was flown to Italy. The Desert War was over. More than 250,000 Axis prisoners were taken in Tunisia, one of the largest single captures of the entire war. Bayerlein had gotten out before the end, but the campaign he had helped to run for more than a year had shaped him in ways that would matter in everything that came next. Chapter 4. The Eastern Experience. Command in Russia. There is a tendency, in accounts of German military careers, to move quickly through the Eastern Front, to treat it as a kind of interval between the more documented campaigns in Africa and Western Europe. Historians of the Eastern Theatre would rightly object to that framing. The war in the Soviet Union was the largest land conflict in human history, and the numbers involved make everything that happened in North Africa look, by comparison, like a skirmish. But for Fritz Bayerlein, the period he spent in the East was relatively compressed, and its significance lies less in what he accomplished there, and more in what it completed in his education as a commander. By the time he arrived in Russia in October of 1943, he had been a staff officer and occasional acting commander at the corps level for 2 years. Now he was being given something he had not formally held before, a division of his own. The formation he was given was the 3rd Hansa Division, sometimes called the Berlin-Brandenburg Division, after the regions that had historically provided its recruits. It was one of the original panzer divisions of the Wehrmacht, and it carried the institutional memory of the campaigns in Poland, France, and the early years in Russia. A formation with experience, with a culture, with veterans who had been through more than most soldiers survive. Taking command of such a unit was a different kind of challenge from anything Bayerlein had faced as a staff officer. Staff work is the management of information and the translation of intent into orders. Command is something more direct and more personal. It is the relationship between a leader and the men he leads. The question of whether they will trust him, whether they will follow him into conditions that every rational instinct argues against entering. The winter of 1943 to 1944 on the Eastern Front was, by any measure, one of the most punishing environments a human being could be asked to function in. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Mechanized equipment failed. The distances involved in any tactical movement were enormous. Soviet forces, which had been rebuilding their strength since the catastrophic losses of the early war years, were now conducting operations with an increasing sophistication and confidence that the German command was struggling to match. Bayerlein commanded the 3rd Panzer Division in this environment for roughly 3 months. From October of 1943 until January of 1944, before receiving new orders that would take him back west. Those 3 months mattered. They completed something in his development as a military leader. He had seen war as an observer, as a cadet on the Western Front in 1918. He had seen it as a staff officer at the operational level in Poland, France, and Africa. He had acted as a commander briefly and by improvisation during the chaos of the Desert Campaign. Now he had commanded in his own right, in an environment that tested everything: logistics, morale, tactical judgment, the ability to allocate insufficient resources among competing needs, the question of how to keep men alive and functional when the physical conditions were working actively against survival. The Eastern Front stripped away any remaining abstractions. It made everything concrete and immediate. The Soviet winter offensive of this period was producing enormous pressure across the entire German line in the east. Divisions that had been in contact with the enemy continuously for months were under strength, short of equipment, short of replacements. The logistics of supporting formations at such distances, in such weather, over roads that frequently ceased to be usable, was a problem that defied conventional solutions. Supply columns that left rear areas in adequate condition sometimes arrived at the front having lost a significant fraction of their cargo to mechanical breakdown, to partisan action, to the simple attrition of operating in extreme cold. Bayerlein managed these constraints as his predecessors had managed them. Imperfectly, with improvisation, and with the constant awareness that the margin between a holding action and a catastrophic collapse was narrower than it appeared on any map. The transfer order that arrived for him in January of 1944 carried him back to Germany. He was to take command of a new formation, a division that was not yet fully assembled, that existed partly on paper and partly in training areas, but that was being built to a specification no other German division in the war had ever matched. The Panzerlehr Division, the Panzer Demonstration Division, was, in conception, the most powerful armoured formation the Wehrmacht had ever put into the field. Its equipment lists read like a catalogue of everything the German tank industry was capable of producing. Its personnel were drawn from the training schools. from the demonstration units that had been responsible for teaching the rest of the army how to fight, which meant, in theory, that its soldiers understood the doctrine better than any formation in the order of battle. This was the command that awaited Bayerlein when he left Russia. It was, by any conventional standard, a remarkable professional achievement. A general officer in his mid-40s, without a background in the traditional officer class, without a title or a family connection, had been selected to lead the most capable division in the German army. The selection reflected something about how the Wehrmacht had changed since 1939. The early losses, the relentless operational demands, the grinding attrition of 4 years of total war, had promoted men on the basis of demonstrated ability in a way that the peacetime army's social hierarchies might never have permitted. Bayerlein had earned this command through Poland, through France, through Africa, through Russia. He had been in the same room as 2 of the war's most important German commanders, and he had learned from both of them. What he could not have known, as he travelled west from Russia to take up this extraordinary new assignment in January of 1944, was what was about to happen to the division he was inheriting. He could not have known. Though in the cold logic of 1944, he may well have suspected that the Panzerlehr division was about to be committed to a battle that would test it more severely than any German formation had been tested in the West, in a theatre where Allied air power had achieved a degree of dominance that made every movement a risk and every road a potential killing ground. He was going to take the best division Germany had, and he was going to watch it destroyed. Not through incompetence, not through cowardice, but through the application, by the other side, of industrial power on a scale that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. Chapter 5. The finest blade, building the Panzerlehr division. The name itself tells you something. Lehr is the German word for instruction or demonstration. It is the same root as Lehrer, a teacher. The Panzerlehr division was built from the demonstration units of the German army's panzer training schools. The 4 formations whose job in peacetime and in the earlier years of the war had been to show other soldiers how armoured warfare was supposed to work. When the decision was made in the winter of 1943 to 1944 to form these units into a combat division, the logic was direct. If you wanted the best equipped and best trained armoured formation in the Wehrmacht, you started with the instructors. The division was formally activated on the 10th of January 1944, with Bayerlein designated as its commander from that date. The organisation process took place primarily around the Nancy-Verdun area in occupied France, drawing personnel and equipment from training facilities at Krampnitz and Bergen, the 2 primary German armoured warfare schools. What assembled over the following weeks was, by the standards of 1944, remarkable. Where a standard German panzer division of this period might field something in the order of 100 operational tanks on a good day, the Panzerlehr division's initial equipment allocation was substantially higher. The division's infantry, the Panzer Grenadier regiments, were also unusual in being fully equipped with half-tracked vehicles, meaning that even the foot soldiers moved on tracks rather than on boots and truck benches. This detail mattered tactically. It meant the infantry could keep up with the armour, could fight mounted, could exploit breakthroughs without losing momentum to the physical limitations of men on foot. There was a historiographical argument that runs through the literature on the Panzerlehr division about exactly how combat ready this formation actually was when it was committed to Normandy. Some accounts drawing partly on Bayerlein's own post-war writings, emphasized the division's strengths, its equipment density, the quality of its personnel, the doctrinal sophistication of its leaders and crews. Others note that building a division from training cadres and assembling it in a matter of weeks, however talented the individual components, does not produce the same kind of unit cohesion that years of shared operational experience create. The veterans of the Eastern Front or North Africa, who filled some of the division's senior positions, brought individual expertise. The question of whether that expertise had been translated into collective, coordinated capability was something that could only be answered in combat. As it turned out, the division would not have long to wait for that answer. Bayerlein spent the months between January and June of 1944 training the division, working through its internal coordination, assessing the capabilities and limitations of his regimental and battalion commanders, and dealing with the complex administrative challenge of integrating personnel from multiple different origins into a single functioning formation. He was also, as every German commander in the West was doing in this period, thinking about the Allied invasion that was clearly coming. It was not a secret. The question was not whether the Western Allies would land in France in 1944, but where and when. The debate within the German command about how to respond to the invasion was itself a significant strategic argument, pitting Rommel's view that the battle had to be won on the beaches against others who believed the armoured reserves should be held back for a decisive counterattack once the landing point was confirmed. That debate had direct consequences for the Panzer-Lehr Division. It was designated as a strategic reserve formation, held in the area between Paris and the Norman coast, available for a commitment once the invasion pattern became clear. This positioning reflected the unresolved disagreement at the top of the German command about how to use armour, close enough to respond quickly if the landing was where it appeared to be, but far enough back to be held in reserve if the initial landing was a feint. The result, as would become apparent after the 6th of June, 1944, was that the division was neither close enough to strike on the first day, nor free enough from command constraints to move at its own discretion once the landing's location was confirmed. When the news of the Allied landings in Normandy reached Bayerlein's headquarters on the 6th of June 1944, the division was not immediately released to move. The argument at the higher levels of command about whether Normandy was the real invasion or a diversion from a larger landing at Pas-de-Calais, a misperception fed in part by an elaborate Allied deception operation, meant that the Panzer reserves were held back for hours that would, in retrospect, prove critical. When the Panzer-Lehr Division finally received its movement orders and began to drive north toward the Normandy front, it did so in daylight, in columns that were fully visible from the air, against an Allied air force that had been given explicit orders to prevent exactly this kind of reinforcement from reaching the beachhead. What happened on those roads in the daylight hours of the 6th and 7th of June established the operational context for everything that followed in Normandy. The division moved in 5 separate columns on different routes, attempting to disperse the target. It did not disperse it enough. Allied fighter bombers, the same Typhoons and Thunderbolts that had been systematically destroying German transport infrastructure for months as part of the pre-invasion air campaign, found the columns and attacked them repeatedly. The losses on that movement to contact were, by German operational standards, significant. Vehicles destroyed, personnel killed, equipment damaged before the division had fired a single shot in the campaign it had been built to fight. Bayerlein arrived at the Normandy front with a formation already depleted from the transit, facing an Allied force that was consolidating its beachhead with increasing speed and determination. The division fought through June in the grinding close-country battle around Caen that characterized the early Normandy campaign. The bocage, the dense Norman hedgerow country that divided the landscape into hundreds of small fields bordered by thick earthwork banks and tangled vegetation, neutralized much of the advantage that armor in open country would have possessed. Tanks that could dominate open terrain became vulnerable in these enclosed fields, where infantry could approach unseen through the hedgerows, and anti-tank weapons could be positioned at ranges too short for the armor to react. The Panzer Division, designed and equipped for the kind of fluid armored warfare that had defined the early campaigns, was being consumed in a positional battle that bore uncomfortable echoes of the First World War, a war of attrition, meter by meter, with losses that could not be adequately replaced. By the end of June, the division had suffered almost 3,000 casualties and had lost around 50 tanks, and the worst was still coming. Chapter 6: The Storm from the Sky. Operation Cobra and the end of Panzer Lehr. The 25th of July 1944 began for Fritz Bayerlein and the Panzer Lehr division with heavy cloud. That weather detail matters, because the operation that the American command had planned for that day, a massive strategic bombing attack immediately preceding a ground assault designed to break through the German lines near St. L, had already been delayed once by weather. On the 24th of July, some German units had detected the preliminary movements on that day and had adjusted their positions in response, which meant that when the bombers finally came in numbers on the 25th, the target area was no longer exactly as the planners had mapped it. But adjustments of position in the face of what was about to happen could not have mattered. The scale of what the American 8th Air Force assembled for Operation Cobra was, by the standards of 1944, extraordinary. Roughly 1,500 heavy bombers, flying fortresses and liberators, were directed against a relatively narrow strip of the front lines held by the Panzer Lehr Division, supplemented by medium bombers and fighter bombers. The total weight of explosives dropped on the division's positions in the space of a few hours has been estimated at something in the range of 4,000 tons, concentrated on a front of perhaps 7 kilometers. The mathematics of that equation are stark. 4,000 tons of explosives in a rectangle 7 kilometers wide and a few kilometers deep against a single division. There was no tactical response to that arithmetic. Tactics require the ability to move, to concentrate, to exploit, to withdraw. All of those options require some base level of structural integrity in the unit being attacked. What the carpet bombing of the 25th of July did to the Panzer Lehr Division was remove the structural integrity. Bayerlein survived. His command post was not directly hit, but the reports that came into him through the remainder of that morning and into the afternoon described a formation that had ceased to exist in the form that he had brought to Normandy. Tanks were buried in bomb craters, their crews either dead or so, disoriented by the concussive force of explosions in close succession, that they could not function. Communications were severed, the radio vehicles destroyed, the wire lines cut, the messengers unable to move through terrain that had been transformed into something the surviving soldiers described as resembling the surface of the moon. Unit commanders could not locate their men. Platoon leaders could not find their platoons. The chain of command, the nerve system that makes a military formation into a coherent entity rather than a collection of frightened individuals, had been severed at dozens of points simultaneously. What Bayerlein said about that day has been quoted repeatedly in accounts of the Normandy campaign, and it is worth noting that the precise phrasing varies between sources. The Spade biography, the American Army's own post-war historical studies, and the accounts that circulated in the 1960s and 70s. The substance is consistent across all versions. He described the division as, for practical purposes, destroyed. He reported that of the tanks that had been operational before the attack, only a handful remained capable of movement. The exact numbers have been restated differently in different sources. Some accounts give 7 operational tanks, some give slightly more. But the order of magnitude is not in dispute. The Panzer Division, which had entered Normandy as the Wehrmacht's most powerful armoured formation, had, within the space of a few hours, been reduced to a fraction of its strength. What followed was the American breakthrough, the ground assault that Operation Cobra had been designed to enable, executed by the 1st United States Army under General Omar Bradley. The surviving German defenders, many of them still stunned by the bombardment, were in no condition to mount the kind of coordinated resistance that might have slowed the advance. American armoured columns moved through the gaps in the German lines and began driving south, and then west, beginning the encirclement of German forces in Normandy that would culminate 3 weeks later in the disaster at the Falaise Pocket. The Panzer Division, or what remained of it, was swept along in the general collapse. There is a specific quality to the defeat that Bayerlein experienced in Normandy that distinguishes it from the other reverses in his career. The defeat at El Alamein had been a campaign lost, a strategic failure produced by the accumulation of logistical shortfalls, Allied material superiority, and an increasingly impossible operational situation. There had been decisions to analyze, turning points to identify, moments where things might have gone differently. Operation Cobra was different. It was not a battle that was lost. It was a battle that was erased. The Panzer Division did not fail at Normandy in any meaningful tactical sense. It was subjected to a form of destruction for which the military vocabulary of the time had no adequate category. This distinction matters for understanding what happened to Bayerlein subsequently and how he understood his own role in the war. He had been a gifted staff officer under Guderian, learning the mechanics of mobile warfare. He had been an effective operational chief of staff under Rommel, managing the complexities of a desert campaign at the outer edge of logistical sustainability. He had commanded a division in Russia under extreme conditions. He had built the Panzer Division into the most capable formation the Wehrmacht had in the West, and then a different kind of power, not tactical genius, not operational skill, not individual courage or leadership, had simply removed all of that from the board. Industrial power, air power, the weight of a production system that was turning out bombers faster than any army in the field could absorb their effects. The war, as Bayerlein was now living it, was no longer being decided by the things that had made his reputation. The division was withdrawn from Normandy after the collapse following Cobra. What remained of it, roughly 7,000 men lost in the campaign, was pulled back toward Germany for rebuilding. Bayerlein went with it. He had been promoted to General Lieutenant in May of 1944, in the weeks before the landings, when the future still appeared to contain at least some possibility of success in the West. He now held the rank of a senior general, commanding a division that existed more on paper than in reality. heading back to Germany to reconstitute a formation that would be committed again before the year was out. In October of 1944, the Panzer Lehr Division began rebuilding at the training grounds at Sennelager in Westphalia. The men came, the equipment came in reduced quantities, and in November of that year, Bayerlein received orders that told him where the rebuilt division was going next. The Ardennes, a winter offensive. A plan that aimed, in the most ambitious reading, to drive through the forested hills of Belgium and Luxembourg to the Meuse, river and beyond, to reach Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated settlement in the west that might allow Germany to turn its full remaining strength against the Soviet advance from the east. Whether anyone at the level of corps or division actually believed this plan could achieve its stated objectives is a question that historians have argued about extensively. And that argument is not settled. What Bayerlein knew as a general who had been in continuous operations for 5 years and who had watched the Panzer Lehr Division destroyed by Allied air power in the summer was the weight of what he was being asked to do. He knew the German army's actual condition. He knew the Allied air force's capabilities. He knew the fuel situation, the replacement situation, the ammunition situation. He went anyway. He had been going to war for 5 years. He did not have a different answer available. The Ardennes offensive began in the darkness of the 16th of December, 1944, in fog and overcast that initially grounded the Allied air forces. For a few days in those grey December mornings, it almost looked like the old war. Armour moving fast, the enemy surprised, the front shifting in ways that had seemed impossible a month before, and somewhere ahead of Bayerlein's advancing columns. On the road network that led through the forested hills toward the Meuse, there was a road junction, an unremarkable Belgian crossroads town. That was about to become one of the most famous addresses in the entire history of the war. Its name was Bastogne. Chapter 7, The Road to Bastogne, Fog, Confusion, and a Crossroads That Would Not Yield. The 16th of December, 1944 arrived, wrapped in a particular kind of winter silence, along a front that stretched from the Losheim Gap in the north, down through the forested hills of the Eifel and the Ardennes. American soldiers in their foxholes woke to cold that cut through even their heaviest coats, to a ground fog that turned the tree lines into grey ghosts, and to a stillness that had, over the preceding weeks, become associated in their minds with a quiet sector, a place where exhausted divisions came to rest after harder fighting elsewhere. The Ardennes, in mid-December of 1944, was not expected to produce a crisis. It produced the largest ground battle the United States Army fought in the entire Second World War. The German operational plan, codenamed Herbstnebel, meaning autumn fog, aimed to drive 3 armies westward through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and reach Antwerp, thereby cutting the Allied supply line and separating the British and American forces from each other. The 1st SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich would drive in the north. The 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel would take the centre. The 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger would cover the southern flank. Within von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army, Bayerlein's rebuilt Panzer Lehr Division formed part of the 47th Panzer Corps, assigned to drive through the centre of the breakthrough and reach the Meuse with maximum speed. The objective was not to fight battles. The objective was to move, to keep moving, to bypass resistance wherever possible, and leave it for the following infantry to deal with. Speed was the logic of the entire plan. Bayerlein had attended the planning conference on the 10th of December, 1944, at Kilburg in the Eifel region, where the map exercise that finalized the operational assignments had been conducted. The distance from the German start line to the Meuse River was roughly 150 kilometers. The planners estimated it could be covered in 2 days, 3 at the outside. That estimate required a sequence of assumptions about road conditions, about fuel availability, about American resistance, about weather that were individually plausible and collectively fragile. Any one of them failing would cascade into the others. Bayerlein, as an experienced operational officer who had worked with supply chains from Poland to North Africa, understood this. Whether he believed the timeline was achievable is a question the historical record does not definitively answer, but his post-war accounts suggest a skepticism he could not express before the offensive began. The Panzerlehr Division crossed the German line of departure in the early hours of the 16th of December and immediately encountered the first of what would prove to be a series of complications that the optimistic planning schedule had not adequately accommodated. The roads in the Ardennes were not the broad paved highways that armoured columns required for rapid movement. They were narrow, often unpaved secondary routes that wound through the hills and valleys of one of the most topographically complex regions in Western Europe. The forest canopy, dense enough in summer to limit visibility, in winter stripped to skeletal branches that nevertheless formed a disorienting maze, enclosed the roads and prevented any meaningful dispersion of the columns. Every tank, every half-track, every supply vehicle had to use the same routes, and the consequence was congestion that turned what should have been a fluid advance into a slow, stop-start crawl. The traffic management problem on the first day of the offensive was severe enough to shape everything that followed. Multiple German formations, converging on a limited road network, produced gridlock at key junctions, with units of different commands intermingling in the darkness and fog in ways that broke up the organizational coherence that made each formation effective. Bayerlein spent the first night of the offensive dealing with the consequences of this congestion, trying to find routes that would move the division forward without losing it in the tangle of stalled columns and wrong turns that characterized that first chaotic night. There is an account which appears in several sources, but whose precise details vary enough to warrant caution, of a local guide or informant directing a Bayerlein column down a road described as passable, which turned out, in the darkness, to be nothing of the sort. What is not disputed is that the division's advance on the first day was substantially slower than planned. The fuel situation introduced a second variable. The Ardennes offensive had been planned around a specific assumption that the advancing German forces would capture American fuel dumps before their own fuel ran out, supplementing their supply from captured stocks. It was a plan that required things to go right, and in this period of the war, things were not reliably going right for Germany. The Panzerlehr Division's fuel allocation at the start of the offensive was, by most accounts, adequate for the initial advance, but not generous enough to absorb the additional consumption caused by the delays, the route changes, and the cold weather that increased fuel consumption in all mechanical vehicles. The margin between having enough fuel to reach the Meuse and running dry, somewhere short of it, was thinner than any operational commander would have chosen. By the 17th and 18th of December, the axis of the 47th Panzer Corps' advance was converging on a specific point in the road network. The town of Bastogne, a modest Belgian market town of several thousand inhabitants that had, before the war, been notable primarily for its butter and its position at the junction of 7 roads. Those 7 roads were the reason Bastogne suddenly mattered in December of 1944. In a region where the topography funneled movement into a limited number of viable routes, a town that sat at the convergence of 7 of them was not merely a waypoint, it was a keystone. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the road network across a significant portion of the operational area. The American command understood this. So did Bayerlein. So did the Corps and Army commanders above him. The race to Bastogne was not a race that Bayerlein won. American forces, specifically elements of the 10th Armored Division that arrived on the 18th of December, followed by the bulk of the 101st Airborne Division that completed its move into the town on the night of the 18th to 19th, reached the approaches to Bastogne and established a defensive perimeter before the Panzerlehr Division could bypass or take the town. There is a specific episode associated with Bayerlein's approach to Bastogne on the night of the 18th to 19th of December. An encounter at the village of Magaret with a local nurse or aid worker who, in circumstances that differ slightly between accounts, provided information about American forces in the area that influenced the direction of the division's advance. The episode has attracted considerable attention in popular histories of the battle, perhaps more than its operational significance strictly warrants, but it illustrates something real about the fog of those first confusing nights. Commanders at every level were making decisions with incomplete and sometimes actively misleading information, and the consequences of those decisions were compounding by the hour. Bayerlein directed the Panzerlehr Division to bypass Bastogne to the south, pushing through Neff and toward the road network, southwest of the town, while other elements of the 47th Corps attempted to encircle the American defenders. This was consistent with the operational logic of the offensive, bypassing resistance, keeping the momentum of the advance alive. But it meant leaving a significant American force astride a critical road junction in the middle of the German operational area. As the encirclement of Bastogne solidified over the following days, that decision's strategic cost became clearer. The 7 roads of Bastogne were not available to the German advance. Every route that ran through the town was blocked, and the American garrison, the 101st Airborne, Combat Command B of the 10th Armored, and a collection of other units that had been swept into the perimeter by the speed of the German advance, showed no intention of yielding the position. The Panzerlehr Division drove west of Bastogne in the days following its initial approach, pushing toward the Meuse with the fuel and momentum it still possessed. For a brief period, the 23rd and 24th of December, before the weather cleared and Allied air power returned to operations, the division reached positions closer to the Meuse than any other German formation, penetrating to within a handful of kilometers of the river at certain points. It was the closest the Ardennes offensive ever came to achieving its first operational objective. Then the sky cleared. The Allied fighter bombers returned. The fuel ran out. The American reserves arrived, and the entire logic of the offensive, which had depended on speed, surprise, and captured fuel, collapsed under the weight of what it could not achieve fast enough. Chapter 8, Nuts, the siege that broke the offensive. The word that entered the history of the Battle of the Bulge on the 22nd of December, 1944 was a single syllable, nuts. It was the reply that Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the American garrison at Bastogne, gave to the German surrender demand delivered to the town's defenders that morning. The demand itself, formal, correct in its military phrasing, signed by the German Corps commander, asked the Americans to surrender to avoid what it described as total annihilation. McAuliffe's response, which required a German officer to ask for clarification, because its precise meaning was initially uncertain to non-native speakers of American English, was an act of institutional defiance that compressed the entire spirit of the Bastogne defense into one word. It was also, in practical terms, a statement of the operational situation. The garrison was not going to move, the town was not going to fall, and the 7 roads were not going to open. For Bayerlein and the Panzer Division, the Bastogne situation was more than a tactical irritant. It was a structural problem embedded in the operational design of the offensive. The division had bypassed the town on schedule, maintaining the advance's forward momentum as the operational plan required. But the roads that ran through Bastogne remained blocked, which meant that the German supply chain, already stretched, already fragile, had to route around the town through secondary routes that were barely adequate for the traffic being forced onto them. Every ammunition convoy, every fuel truck, every replacement vehicle that needed to reach the forward elements of the 47th Corps had to navigate the alternative routes around a town that should, by the plan's timetable, have already fallen. The plan had not anticipated the possibility of a sustained, effective American defense at that specific junction. The weather that had grounded Allied air power for the first week of the offensive broke on the 23rd of December. Christmas Eve of 1944 brought clear skies and a hard frost, ideal flying conditions for the Allied tactical air forces that had been waiting, fuel and ordnance loaded for exactly this moment. The effect was immediate and severe. German columns that had been moving, however slowly, found themselves under air attack across the entire operational area. Supply convoys were hit on the roads. Fuel dumps that had been assembled near the front were bombed and burned. Armoured vehicles that had survived the advance found themselves unable to move for want of fuel, then attacked from the air while stationary. The same logic that had destroyed the Panzer Division in the summer at St. El was reasserting itself, this time in the snow and cold of the Ardennes. For the men of the 100 and 1st Airborne and the other American units inside the Bastogne perimeter, the weather break brought relief of a more direct kind. On the 23rd of December, American transport aircraft flew resupply missions over the town, dropping ammunition, medical supplies, and food to a garrison that had been fighting in near isolation for 5 days. The resupply was not complete. Not everything fell inside the perimeter. Not everything that fell was what the defenders most urgently needed. But it was enough. It sustained the defense for the days that followed, and it sent a message about Allied logistical reach that was itself strategically significant. Even an encircled garrison, even in weather that had been freezing the entire region for a week, could be supplied from the air. The German formation surrounding Bastogne could not count on starvation as an ally. The relief of Bastogne by elements of General George Patton's 3rd United States Army, arriving from the south on the 26th of December, brought the siege phase to an end, and definitively broke the southern shoulder of the Ardennes offensive. The corridor, opened by the 4th Armoured Division's advance, was narrow, contested for days on either side by German forces attempting to close it. But it was enough. Supplies and reinforcements flowed into Bastogne. The encircled garrison, which had been fighting with the particular intensity that comes from knowing there is no way out except forward, was now connected to the broader Allied line. The offensive had failed to take the town. It had failed to close the corridor in time, and with the corridor open, the operational logic of the entire German plan had been invalidated. Bayerlein's Panzerlehr Division, during this same period, was fighting its own battles west and southwest of Bastogne, attempting to maintain its westward advance while simultaneously dealing with American flanking pressure that grew more intense as Patton's army pushed north. The division was fighting on inadequate fuel, with ammunition stocks that were not being adequately replenished through the contested road network against American forces that were receiving everything they needed through a logistics system that, whatever its imperfections, was not running dry. The asymmetry that had defined the Normandy campaign was reasserting itself in the winter forest, in different weather and different terrain, but with the same underlying logic. One side had enough, and one side was running out. The German High Command's response to the stalling of the offensive was to order further attacks, to push harder, to commit reserves, to insist that the objectives were still achievable if the men on the ground simply made more effort. Bayerlein, as a divisional commander who knew exactly what his division had and what it lacked, found himself in the position that German commanders at every level increasingly occupied in the final year of the war, caught between orders from above that reflected the strategic preferences of a high command that was losing its grip on operational reality and the actual condition of the men and machines under his command. He continued to fight. He continued to attack where ordered, but the offensive was already over in everything, except the formal sense, and men who had been fighting since the early hours of the 16th of December, in cold, in snow, on diminishing fuel and ammunition, understood this at a level that no headquarters order could override. By the first days of January 1945, the Ardennes offensive had definitively passed from its offensive phase into something that no one in the German command wanted to acknowledge formally, but that everyone in a forward position already knew. A retreat, the ground gained, the bulge that gave the campaign its English name, was being steadily reduced as American forces pressed from north and south. The Panzerlehr Division, reconstituted after Normandy, and committed again after less than 3 months of rebuilding, had once again been ground down through weeks of continuous combat. It had not been destroyed in the single catastrophic hours of Operation Cobra. This time, the attrition was slower, more incremental, the daily subtraction of vehicles and men in fighting that produced no strategic result. The effect was the same. What Bayerlein took away from the Ardennes, beyond the operational disappointment, beyond the physical exhaustion of 2 major campaigns in less than 6 months, was a clearer version of a conclusion he had been building toward since Normandy. The war's outcome was not in doubt. The German army could fight with great skill, great discipline, great individual and collective courage, and it could not change what the factories of Detroit and the shipyards of the Clyde and the oil fields of Texas had already decided. He was not the only German general who had reached this conclusion. He was not even among the first, but he was living it at divisional level in real time, with the evidence arriving daily in the form of reports from battalion commanders asking for fuel that was not there and ammunition that had not come forward. The Ardennes offensive officially ended in late January of 1945 as German forces withdrew back to their original start lines and in some sectors beyond them. The battle had consumed German reserves in men, in armor, in fuel, in ammunition that could not be replaced. The Eastern Front, where Soviet forces had launched the Vistula-Oder offensive on the 12th of January, was now producing the deepest and fastest advance in the history of that theatre. Germany was being compressed from both sides, and the resources to hold either front adequately, let alone both, were simply not there. For Bayerlein, the end of the Ardennes meant the beginning of the last phase, the defense of Germany itself. Chapter 9, The Long Retreat, Defending the Reich. There is a specific quality to the fighting of early 1945 that distinguishes it from every earlier phase of the war, and that quality is the knowledge, shared by almost everyone in the German army, above the rank of corporal, and by a great many below it, that the war was irretrievably lost. This was not defeatism in the formal sense that the Nazi legal system defined and prosecuted, sometimes fatally. It was simply arithmetic. The Soviet winter offensive of January 1945 was, in scale and speed, unlike anything the Eastern Front had previously produced. Soviet armored columns reached the Oder River, less than 100 kilometers from Berlin, within 3 weeks of crossing their start line. In the west, Allied forces were repairing the damage done to their lines by the Ardennes offensive and preparing to cross the Rhine. Germany, in the early weeks of 1945, was running out of room. For Bayerlein and the Panzer Division, the transition from the Ardennes to the final campaign in the west was marked by movement and reorganization that reflected the broader German strategic collapse. The division was transferred from one army command to another as the situation shifted. It fought rearguard actions along the west bank of the Rhine, attempting to slow Allied advances and cover the withdrawal of German forces across the river. These actions were fought by a division that was, by this point, a shadow of the formation that had assembled at Senneliger in October of the previous year. The rebuilding done in that brief interval had been consumed in the Ardennes. What remained was experienced, often determinedly professional, but thin in numbers, thin in equipment, thin in the logistical support that makes any military operation coherent rather than simply desperate. The Allied crossing of the Rhine, which began at Remagen on the 7th of March, 1945, when American forces discovered the Ludendorff Bridge, still standing and crossed before it could be demolished, accelerated the strategic deterioration dramatically. The Rhine had represented, in German military planning, the last major geographic obstacle that could significantly delay an Allied advance into the German heartland. Once it was crossed, the industrial Ruhr region, the complex of coal mines, steel plants, and manufacturing facilities that had underpinned the German war economy throughout the conflict, was exposed to encirclement. The Ruhr was not merely economically important. It was, by the spring of 1945, one of the few remaining areas where significant German forces were concentrated, which made it simultaneously the most important strategic objective on the Western Front, and the most vulnerable to the kind of sweeping armored encirclement that American forces had demonstrated repeatedly since the breakout from Normandy. The encirclement of the Ruhr, what became known to the American side as the Ruhr Pocket, was completed in the third week of March and the first days of April 1945. Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B, caught inside the pocket, contained the remnants of multiple German armies, including formations that had been fighting continuously since Normandy and the Ardennes. The total number of German troops trapped in the Ruhr Pocket was enormous. Estimates run to more than 300,000 men, though the precise accounting is complicated by the fluid conditions of the encirclement's formation and the presence of civilians, foreign workers, and semi-military formations of various kinds alongside the regular army. Bayerlein's Panzer Lehr Division was among the formations caught inside. The condition of the German forces in the Ruhr Pocket in those first weeks of April 1945 was, by any honest account, desperate. Fuel was almost non-existent. Ammunition was running low. The urban and industrial landscape of the Ruhr, already heavily damaged by Allied strategic bombing campaigns that had been targeting its factories and infrastructure since 1942, offered some cover but little logistical support. American forces were pressing in from the south and east, compressing the pocket. The Luftwaffe, which might in an earlier phase of the war have attempted some form of resupply or support, was effectively absent. Its aircraft destroyed, its pilots killed or grounded for lack of aviation fuel, its ability to contest the Allied air forces that now dominated the skies over the Ruhr entirely gone. For Bayerlein, this period produced a confrontation with an order that crystallized the moral problem that many German officers had been evading or managing throughout the final phase of the war. Hitler's Nero Decree, issued in March of 1945, ordering the destruction of all industrial, infrastructure, and communications facilities that might fall into Allied hands, was, if followed, the deliberate demolition of Germany's post-war recovery capacity. Bridges were to be blown, power plants destroyed, factory machinery dismantled or wrecked. The logic was the logic of scorched earth, taken to its ultimate conclusion. If Germany was going to lose, it would leave nothing. Albert Speer, as armaments minister, worked against this order from within the system, arguing that destroying Germany's infrastructure would kill the German people rather than slow the Allies. Many officers in the field simply did not carry the order out, not always as an act of formal moral resistance, but as a combination of inability, disbelief, and a quiet refusal to add further destruction to a country that had already suffered enough. Bayerlein belonged to this latter group. He did not grandly announce his refusal. He did not write a memorandum for the record. He simply, in the practical conditions of the Ruhr pocket in April of 1945, did not destroy what he was ordered to destroy. The bridges in his sector remained standing where they could remain standing without direct tactical justification for demolition. The details of exactly what he preserved and what he could not are not fully documented. The chaos of those final weeks makes precise reconstruction difficult, but the general pattern of his behavior in this period is consistent with someone who had decided, at some level that preceded formal decision-making, that the war was over, and that the additional deaths and additional destruction demanded by continuing it were no longer justifiable. He was a professional soldier operating in a collapsing system, and the system's final demands were ones he was unwilling to meet fully. By mid-April of 1945, Field Marshal Model, facing the total collapse of resistance inside the Ruhr pocket, and unwilling either to surrender formally or to order a breakout that he knew would fail, dissolved Army Group B, releasing each soldier to make his own decision. It was an unusual and in some ways deeply personal act, and Model followed it shortly afterward with his own suicide in a forest near Duisburg, unwilling to surrender, unwilling to escape, choosing a soldier's end rather than a prisoner's captivity. For the men under his command, the dissolution of the army group meant the end of any organized resistance. Surrender, individually or in small groups, became the only remaining option. The scale of the surrender in the Ruhr was staggering. Over several days in mid to late April, more than 300,000 German soldiers, among the largest single capitulations of the war in any theater, laid down their weapons to American forces. For many of them, it was the first time in years that the immediate future contained something other than the prospect of being killed. For Bayerlein, who had been in continuous military service since 1917, and in active combat since September of 1939. The moment of surrender marked the end of a professional life that had defined his entire adult existence. He was 46 years old. The war had lasted, for him personally, almost 6 years. He had fought on more fronts, under more conditions, and at more levels of command than almost anyone else in the German military structure. And now it was over. The specific circumstances of Bayerlein's surrender in April of 1945, to which American unit, at precisely what location, under what conditions, are details that vary slightly in different accounts of the Ruhr Pocket's collapse. What is consistent across sources is that he surrendered in the general dissolution of Army Group B in the third week of April, that he was taken into American captivity along with the other senior officers caught in the pocket, and that he entered the prisoner of war system that would hold him for the next several years. The man who had ridden with Guderian into Poland, who had managed Rommel's operations room in the desert, who had commanded the most powerful armoured division the Wehrmacht ever fielded, was now a prisoner. The career was over. The accounting was about to begin. Chapter 10. Captivity and Conscience. The prisoner years, the American prisoner of war system that processed the captured German officers from the Ruhr Pocket in April and May of 1945, was operating at a scale it had not anticipated. The collapse of organized German resistance in the West was producing prisoners in numbers that strained every administrative and logistical system designed to handle them. Temporary enclosures along the Rhine, sometimes described with grim accuracy as open fields surrounded by wire, with minimal shelter and food supply lines that were overwhelmed by the sudden influx, held hundreds of thousands of prisoners in conditions that were, by the spring of 1945, difficult and sometimes dangerous, though not deliberately punitive in the way that other prisoner systems in this war had been. The distinction mattered, and most German officers who passed through American captivity in this period understood it. Bayerlein was processed through the American military intelligence system along with the other captured senior officers. This process, interviews, debriefings, the systematic extraction of operational information from men who had commanded at corps and division level, was one of the most valuable historical documents the post-war period produced. The American Army's historical branch, working with captured German officers, compiled an enormous body of operational analysis that drew on the memories and assessments of the men who had actually directed the German war effort at the tactical and operational level. Bayerlein participated in this process. He was a willing and apparently frank informant. His post-war accounts of the North Africa campaign, of Normandy, and of the Ardennes have been cited by historians for decades as primary source material, while also being treated with appropriate skepticism about the selective recall and self-justification that inevitably shapes any memoir-style account. The prisoner years produced something beyond intelligence value. They produced, for Bayerlein, as for many German officers of his generation and rank, a confrontation with questions that the pace of active service had allowed to be deferred. What had the war been for? What had the Germany that sent them into Poland and France and Africa and Russia actually been in its ideological character, in its treatment of peoples under its occupation, in the machinery of persecution that had operated alongside, and sometimes within the same military apparatus that these officers had served? These questions did not always produce the answers that post-war Allied prosecutors and analysts hoped for. Many German officers, in captivity and afterward, maintained a professional self-image that drew a sharp line between the military conduct of the war which they characterized as conventional and professionally honorable, and the political and racial programs of the regime they had served. The line was not always as sharp as its drawers believed, and historians have spent the decades since 1945 examining exactly where the boundaries held and where they did not. For Bayerlein, the available evidence suggests a man who had fought professionally and competently, who had not been associated with the specific crimes that brought other officers to trial at Nuremberg, and in subsequent proceedings, and who held views on the war and its outcome that were complex and not easily reduced to either repentance or defiance. He had served a regime, he had served it well. He had commanded men who died in its service. He had himself suffered, physically, through the illnesses of the Africa campaign, through wounds, through the grinding exhaustion of continuous operations, in the service of a war that had ended in complete defeat. The question of what all of that had meant was not one that submitted to easy resolution. The formal end of the European war came on the 8th of May, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. For prisoners already in captivity, the practical consequences were not immediate. The administrative processing of hundreds of thousands of captured men, determining who would be held for further intelligence exploitation, who would face prosecution for war crimes, who would be released and repatriated, took months and in some cases years. Senior officers like Bayerlein, who commanded at divisional level and above, were typically held longer than junior officers and enlisted men, both because their intelligence value was higher and because the process of screening them for potential prosecution required more thorough investigation. Bayerlein was held in American captivity through 1945 and into 1946. The conditions improved significantly after the initial chaotic weeks of the Ruhr surrender. Officers were housed in facilities that, while not comfortable, provided adequate food, medical care, and a degree of structured existence. Many captured officers used the time to write memoirs, operational analyses, assessments of specific battles and campaigns. This body of writing, produced under American historical program auspices, or privately, or as part of formal debriefing sessions, constitutes a significant portion of what we know about how the German army at the operational level understood and experienced the war. Bayerlein contributed substantially to this literature, particularly in his accounts of the North Africa campaign and the Normandy fighting, which drew on his first-hand operational knowledge in ways that gave them a specificity and credibility that purely secondary accounts could not match. The process of denazification, the Allied program for identifying and categorizing German citizens and soldiers based on their involvement with the Nazi regime, ran its course through the captivity period and into the years after release. Bayerlein's case, like that of most professional military officers who had not held formal party positions or been associated with specific criminal actions, was handled through the classification tribunals that sorted the German officer corps into categories ranging from major offenders to followers. The proceedings were imperfect instruments for the complexity of the moral situations they were trying to assess, and many historians have noted that the denazification process was more effective at producing paperwork than at achieving the broader transformation of German society that its architects had hoped for. Bayerlein passed through the process without facing prosecution, which placed him in the large majority of German officers whose service in the war, whatever its complexities, did not result in criminal proceedings. He was released from captivity, The specific date is given in different sources as either 1947 or the period around that year, with the Spade biography providing the most reliable account, and returned to Würzburg, the city where he had been born. He was in his late 40s. He had no military career to return to. The German army, under the terms of the post-war settlement, ceased to exist, and the men who had served in it returned to civilian life. He had no particular profession beyond the military, having entered uniform at 18 and spent virtually his entire adult life in uniform. The city he returned to had been devastated by Allied bombing, including the catastrophic raid of the 16th of March, 1945, which had destroyed much of Würzburg's historic centre. The country he returned to was divided, occupied, and in the early stages of a rebuilding process that would, in the following decade, produce the Federal Republic of Germany. He was, in the most literal sense, starting over. And the man who started over was not the same man who had left that city in 1917 as an 18-year-old cadet. He had been shaped by everything in between, by the deserts of Libya and Egypt, by the Russian winter, by the hedgerows of Normandy, by the snow of the Ardennes, by the collapsing ruins of the Ruhr. And the task of translating that experience into something that could sustain a civilian life in a rebuilt Germany was not a simple one. Bayerlein was not unique in facing this transition. The entire German officer corps faced it. What varied was how individual men navigated the gap between who they had been and who they now needed to become. Chapter 11. The Long Peace Returning. To Dutzburg. The Germany that Fritz Bayerlein returned to in the late 1940s was, in its physical and social character, almost unrecognizable as the country that had sent him to war. The cities were damaged, many of them severely. The political and institutional structures that had defined German life since at least the unification of 1871 had been swept away. The Reich was gone. The imperial tradition that had persisted through the Weimar Republic and been appropriated by the Nazi period was simply absent. The Allied occupation zones administered the country under 4 separate systems, and the division that would eventually produce 2 German states, the Federal Republic in the west and the Democratic Republic in the east, was already taking shape. What existed in the immediate post-war years was a strange in-between condition. A country without formal sovereignty, administered by its conquerors, beginning the physical and psychological work of rebuilding from a defeat that had been, by any measurement, total. Würzburg itself was a specific case in point. The city on the Main had survived the war in reasonable condition until the final weeks, when a British Royal Air Force raid on the night of the 16th of March, 1945, had killed somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 people, and destroyed a substantial portion of the historic city centre, the Baroque facades, the church towers, the university buildings, the bridges. Much of what had defined the city's physical character had been destroyed in a single night. The city that Bayerlein returned to was familiar in its geography and its streets, but profoundly altered in its appearance, its mood, and the composition of its population. People were rebuilding. People were also processing. The losses, the displacements, the return of former prisoners and soldiers from captivity, the slow integration back into ordinary life of men who had spent years in extraordinary conditions. The adjustment that former soldiers and officers made to civilian life in this period was not uniform, and the historical literature on it is extensive and sometimes conflicting. Some accounts emphasize the smoothness of the transition, the practical German capacity for getting on with the work at hand. Other accounts drawing on psychological and social research from the period, emphasized the silences, the things that were not said, the ways in which an entire generation of processed collective trauma by not discussing it, by focusing on rebuilding, by finding in the physical act of reconstruction a substitute for the emotional work that was too difficult to undertake directly. Both observations are probably true in different proportions for different individuals, and the honest answer is that the inner life of any individual soldier's post-war transition is largely inaccessible to historical research that depends on documents and formal accounts. What we know about Bayerlein in the post-war years comes primarily from the Spade biography, the product of more than 5 years of research that included interviews with people who knew him in his final decades, examination of his personal papers and family photographs, and the cooperation of his nephew, who provided access to private materials that might otherwise have remained unknown. The picture that emerges is of a man who remained engaged with the history he had lived, who wrote, who corresponded with former comrades and with historians, who participated in the documentation of the campaigns he had served in, while also making a genuine effort to construct a civilian existence that had its own meaning and texture. He was not, by his own apparent inclination, or by the circumstances of post-war German life, a man who sought public prominence. The culture of the early Federal Republic was, in many respects, one of deliberate distance from the war. A desire, understandable and in some ways necessary, to separate the new Germany from the catastrophe of the old. Former officers who were too prominent, too vocal, or too closely associated with specific episodes of the war could find themselves in uncomfortable positions, caught between the demands of a society that wanted to move on and the expectations of a veteran's culture that wanted its service acknowledged. Bayerlein navigated this in his own way, which appears to have involved selective engagement, contributing to historical projects that interested him, maintaining personal connections with the small community of people who had shared his experiences, but not seeking the public profile that might have been available to a man of his record. Rommel's memory was, in the post-war period, a particular complication for those who had served closely with him. Rommel had died in October of 1944, forced to take cyanide after his implication, indirect and disputed in its precise nature, in the conspiracy against Hitler of the 20th of July 1944. His death had been publicly presented as being from wounds, and his funeral had been a state occasion. The truth of how he died became known after the war, and his subsequent historical reputation acquired a particular character. He was presented in many accounts as a figure of the other Germany, a brilliant professional soldier who had served loyally, but who had ultimately been destroyed by the regime he served. The accuracy of this characterization has been debated extensively, with historians arguing about the degree to which Rommel was implicated in or aware of the conspiracy, about his earlier record in Africa and its relationship to the occupation policies of the wider war, about the uses to which his memory was put by post-war German culture. Bayerlein knew Rommel as well as anyone who was not a member of his family. He had worked alongside him for more than a year in the most demanding conditions of the African campaign. His accounts of Rommel, given in interviews and written accounts over the years after the war, are among the most valuable primary source assessments of the man as a military professional. Manfred Rommel, Erwin's son, and later the long-serving mayor of Stuttgart, knew Bayerlein and provided testimony about his character for the Spade biography, describing a personal friendship and a depth of mutual regard that had survived the war and its aftermath. That connection to Rommel's memory and to Rommel's family was one of the threads that ran through Bayerlein's post-war life, giving it a continuity with the world he had come from. The rearmament of West Germany in the 1950s, as the Federal Republic joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and created the Bundeswehr, brought the question of what role, if any, former Wehrmacht officers would play in the new German military establishment. The Bundeswehr drew on former Wehrmacht officers for its leadership cadre in its early years. A practical necessity, given that the institutional military knowledge of the country resided almost entirely in men who had served in the previous army. The process involved formal reviews, the application of criteria designed to exclude men with serious criminal associations or character deficiencies, and a cultural negotiation about what the new German military would inherit and what it would deliberately leave behind. Bayerlein's participation in this process was limited. He was no longer young, in his mid-50s, by the time the Bundeswehr was formally established in 1955, and his health, which had been compromised by the illnesses of the African campaign and the physical demands of continuous active service, did not support a return to active duty. He served in an advisory capacity in the early years of Bundeswehr development, contributing the operational experience he possessed to an institutional conversation about how a new German army should think about mobile warfare, about logistics, about the relationship between armor and infantry that had defined the campaigns he had directed. He was a resource, a living archive of a kind of operational knowledge that could not be found in any textbook. The intellectual engagement of these years also took the form of writing. Bayerlein contributed to the compilation of operational histories that were being assembled in this period, both through the American Military History Institute's project of interviewing former German officers and through German language publications that were beginning to address the military history of the war with the distance that the post-war years were slowly making possible. These contributions varied in their analytical depth. The personal memoir elements were naturally shaped by the author's perspective and interests, but they constituted a genuine addition to the historical record, providing operational detail that documentary sources alone could not supply. Chapter 12, The Weight of Memory, History's Verdict on a Complicated Soldier. There is a particular kind of historical figure who presents a genuine interpretive difficulty. Someone who was genuinely capable, who operated within a genuinely criminal system, who committed neither the worst acts that system produced nor the best responses to it, that individual conscience made possible, and who ended his life in obscurity without resolving, to history's satisfaction, the question of what to make of him. Fritz Bayerlein is, in important respects, this kind of figure. And the discomfort that comes with that category is not a failure of historical method. It is an accurate reflection of the moral complexity of the world he lived in. The question of what to make of the professional German officer corps of the Second World War is one that has occupied historians, philosophers, legal scholars, and veterans for more than 8 decades. And it has not been resolved in the way that simpler historical verdicts are resolved. The Nuremberg tribunals established clear legal categories for the worst offenders. The denazification tribunals processed the mass of the middle range, with varying degrees of effectiveness. But the vast majority of the German military's officer corps, the men who fought the campaigns, directed the operations, kept the formations in the field from September 1939 to May 1945, occupy a moral space that does not map neatly onto the categories of either guilt or innocence that post-war legal frameworks were designed to assign. Bayerlein served in Poland, a campaign that, in the weeks following the military conquest, became the site of systematic atrocities against Jewish and Polish civilians, carried out by units that operated in the rear areas behind the advancing Wehrmacht. He was a forward operational officer, not an administrator of rear area policy, and there is no documented evidence that he participated in or directed these actions. But he served in the same system, in the same institutional structure, in the same war that produced them. The question of what he knew and when, and what that knowledge required of him, is one that the historical record does not fully answer, because it is a question that very few people in his position answered fully, either at the time or afterward. In Africa, the campaign has often been characterized as one of the cleaner theaters of the war, a characterization that requires significant qualification. The treatment of prisoners taken in the desert by both sides was, on the whole, more consistent with the laws of war than what was happening simultaneously in the Soviet Union or in occupied Eastern Europe. But North Africa was not free of the wider ideological context of the war. The policy of the German command in Africa toward Jewish residents of occupied territories, toward Allied commandos, toward the treatment of certain categories of prisoner, was shaped by the same regime that was conducting the Holocaust, in parallel with the military campaigns. Bayerlein, as Chief of Staff, was aware of these policies to the degree that any senior officer in his position would have been, and the questions of what awareness required are not made simpler by the fact that his personal conduct appears to have been, in its individual dimensions, professionally correct. The Panzer-Lehr Division's record in Normandy and in the Ardennes, the two major campaigns that Bayerlein directed at divisional level, does not appear in the historical record as the source of systematic atrocities, and the division is not prominently associated with the war crimes investigations that examined the conduct of German units in France in 1944. This is a meaningful observation, not a conclusive one. Absence from atrocity records reflects a combination of actual conduct, documentation survival, and the selective focus of post-war investigations. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that Bayerlein commanded his division as a military formation with military objectives, that his operational decisions were framed in tactical and operational terms rather than in ideological ones, and that the men under his command fought, by the standards of the campaigns they participated in, as soldiers rather than as instruments of political persecution. The post-war Bayerlein, the man who returned to Würzburg, who contributed to historical projects, who maintained friendships with former comrades, who navigated the denazification process, who lived out his final decades in relative quiet, presents a different set of questions. His cooperation with American historical projects produced information that has been genuinely valuable to historians. His contributions to the documentation of the North African campaign and the Normandy fighting are cited in works that will be read for as long as people study the Second World War. He did not, as far as the record shows, engage in the public rehabilitation of Nazi ideology that occupied some former officers and officials in the post-war period. He appears to have accepted the defeat and its consequences in the straightforward sense of living in the world they produced, without the bitterness and revanchism that marked some of his contemporaries. What he did not do, what almost no one in his position did, was produce a thorough, publicly available reckoning with the full moral dimensions of his service. The memoirs and accounts he wrote and contributed to were operational histories, not moral confessions. They addressed the questions of whether a particular attack succeeded or failed, whether a particular decision was correct, given the information available, whether Rommel or Guderian or von Manteuffel made the right call in a specific situation. They did not, in any systematic way, address the question of what it meant to have served, effectively and loyally, a regime whose crimes were being documented in the same system period, in the same cities where those operational histories were being written. This silence, which is more accurately described as a selective focus, a professional historian's framing that kept the operational lens firmly in place and avoided the wider moral one, was not unique to Bayerlein. It was the characteristic response of the professional German officer corps to the post-war period, a response that has itself become a subject of serious historical analysis. The clean Wehrmacht narrative, the idea that the professional military had fought a conventional war separate from the ideological crimes of the SS and the party, was a construct that served immediate post-war purposes, and that scholarship from the 1980s onward has systematically and effectively challenged. Bayerlein's own accounts contributed, however unintentionally, to this narrative by emphasizing the operational dimensions of his service at the expense of its broader context. The Spade biography, published in the early years of the 21st century, represents the most serious attempt to present Bayerlein's life in something approaching its full complexity. It draws on family materials, personal correspondence, operational records, and the testimony of people who knew him in his final years. Its portrait is of a man who was, in his personal relationships, warm, capable of genuine affection for the people around him, the kind of commander whose soldiers remembered him as accessible and human, rather than remote and authoritarian. The detail that Manfred Rommel provided for that biography of Bayerlein's gentleness toward children, of his personal charm, of the qualities that existed alongside the operational competence, is not a rehabilitation of his service record. It is a reminder that the people who participate in history's largest events are not simplified by their participation. They remain fully human, capable of both warmth and complicity, both courage and moral failure, in proportions that resist reduction. He died in Wurzburg on the 30th of January, 1970. The same city, the same river valley, the same Bavarian landscape that had held him at the beginning. He was 71 years old. He had outlived Rommel by more than 25 years. He had outlived Guderian, who died in 1954. He had outlived most of the men who had driven with him across the Western Desert, who had marched with him into France in 1940, who had gone forward with him on the 16th of December 1944 in the last darkness before the last offensive. He had outlived, in the simplest sense, the world that had made him what he was. What that world had made him was a soldier of exceptional professional capacity, who served in one of the most inconsequential and most criminal state structures of the modern era, who neither reached the heights of moral courage that the moment, in retrospect, clearly demanded, nor descended to the specific crimes that define the worst of what that era produced. He existed, as most people exist in history's extreme circumstances, in the complicated middle. Neither the hero nor the villain that the narrative demands, but the human being that the record actually shows. His story is not comfortable. It was not meant to be, and the fact that it is not comfortable is precisely the reason it deserves to be told in full. The next 6 chapters will take us into the specific battles in greater detail. Back into the desert with Rommel, forward into the hedgerows with Bayerlein, at the head of his great armoured division. and into the final weeks in the Ruhr, where the last decisions of his military life were made in a destroyed industrial landscape, and a Germany that was running out of everything. If you are still with us, and by now I suspect you know whether this kind of history is for you, then settle in, because we are not close to finished yet. Subscribe if you have not already. Leave a comment with the chapter that spoke to you most. We will be back with chapters 13 through 18, the final arc, the desert up close, the division's last stand, and the quiet man who went home to Würzburg and spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of everything he had seen. Chapter 13, the desert close up, Rommel's operational mind, and the man who mapped it to understand what Fritz Bayerlein did in North Africa, what the role of chief of staff actually meant in the specific context of Rommel's army. It helps to understand something about how Rommel commanded, because Rommel's command style was unusual enough to create problems that an ordinary staff arrangement could not solve. Most army commanders of the Second World War directed their formations from a fixed rear headquarters, receiving reports from the front, forming a picture of the battle, issuing orders through an established chain. The headquarters moved periodically, but it maintained a stable physical presence at a specific location, connected to subordinate formations by telephone wire and radio, staffed by officers who knew where everything was and could answer a query from any level of the chain at any time. This system, however imperfect, was legible. It had an address. Rommel's headquarters, when Rommel was operating at his characteristic tempo, was wherever Rommel happened to be. He moved to the front. He moved to crisis points. He appeared at a brigade headquarters when a battalion was in trouble. He drove forward in his command vehicle to see with his own eyes what his maps were telling him, because he did not entirely trust the process by which frontline reality was translated into map symbols and then transmitted rearward. This instinct for personal observation produced some of his most remarkable operational decisions. The speed and audacity of his responses in the early phases of both his 1941 offensive and the Gazala battle of the following year were enabled precisely by his physical proximity to the action. But it also meant that there were hours, sometimes entire days, when the commander of the Afrika Corps was not reachable by his own headquarters. He was somewhere forward, in a vehicle under fire or recently under fire, making decisions in real time that his staff had to subsequently reconstruct and incorporate into the operational picture. Bayerlein was the officer who held the headquarters together during those absences. He was the institutional memory, the operational continuity, the man who kept the thread from breaking when Rommel disappeared forward into the battle. This required a specific kind of intelligence. Not the creative brilliance that Rommel brought to the tactical problem, but something equally rare and less frequently celebrated: the ability to synthesize imperfect information into a coherent operational picture, to make decisions in the commander's name that were consistent with the commander's intent, without being explicitly authorized, and to do all of this while simultaneously managing the administrative and logistical demands of a force operating more than 2,000 kilometers from its supply base. The supply question was, in retrospect, the central fact of the North Africa campaign for the Axis side. Rommel understood this intellectually, but resisted it temperamentally. His instinct was always forward, to press the advantage, to exploit the disorganization of the British command, to move faster than the supply situation strictly permitted. His staff, including Bayerlein, understood the arithmetic of this approach. Every additional kilometer of advance stretched the supply line further, increased consumption, reduced the margin. The fuel that reached the front had to cover the distance from Tripoli, later from Benghazi, as the front moved east, over roads that were themselves consuming vehicles and maintenance resources. Every day the front moved east, the problem grew harder. The period between the second Cyrenaica campaign in the spring of 1942 and the battles around El Alamein in the summer and autumn of that year represents the peak of Bayerlein's North African experience. The period when the operational problems were most complex and the stakes were highest. After Rommel's forces took Tobruk in June of 1942, a fortress that had held out against them for 8 months the previous year, and crossed into Egypt, the sense at Afrika Korps headquarters was of a campaign that had suddenly acquired a different dimension. Cairo was not an abstraction on a map. It was a real city, a real objective, and the road to it ran through the narrow coastal corridor between the Mediterranean and the Qattara Depression. The corridor was 40 kilometers wide at El Alamein. It was the one place in the entire western desert where the flank could not be turned because the depression, a vast, impassable salt marsh lying well below sea level, anchored the southern end of any defensive line absolutely. Rommel could not go around. He had to go through. The First Battle of El Alamein in July of 1942 was Rommel's attempt to go through, and it failed. Not dramatically, not in a single decisive engagement, but in the grinding attrition of a series of attacks that consumed men and vehicles that could not be replaced at anything approaching the rate of loss. Bayerlein was managing the supply picture throughout this period, and the numbers were unambiguous. German and Italian losses in men, tanks, and artillery were running substantially ahead of what the supply convoys could compensate for. The Allied air forces were systematically attacking Axis shipping in the Mediterranean, sinking tankers, destroying the cargo ships that carried the ammunition and spare parts, without which a mechanized army cannot function. The supply chain was not merely stretched, it was being actively cut. This is the period in which Bayerlein's operational notebooks, had they survived in full, would make the most illuminating reading. The day-to-day management of a campaign that was simultaneously winning tactically and losing logistically, in which the commander's instinct drove the army further forward than the supply situation could sustain, required a quality of professional judgment that is difficult to reconstruct from the outside. Every morning, the chief of staff faced a set of numbers: fuel available, ammunition available, vehicles operational, and had to translate those numbers into an honest assessment of what was and was not possible. Every evening, the commander's decisions had altered those numbers in ways that moved the margin closer to the edge. The distance between what Rommel wanted to do and what the supply situation would permit was, through the summer of 1942, one of the most consequential gaps in the entire campaign. The Second Battle of El Alamein, which began in the late night hours of the 23rd of October, 1942, found Rommel absent. He was in Germany, receiving medical treatment for the conditions produced by months of desert service. And Bayerlein, once again, holding the operational center during a crisis. General Georg Stumm, who had been assigned to command in Rommel's absence, died of a heart attack on the opening day of Montgomery's offensive, leaving the formation briefly without any senior command. Rommel flew back to Africa as the battle developed, resuming command of a deteriorating situation against a British force that had been carefully prepared, carefully supplied, and carefully led to a degree that the Afrika Korps had not faced in its previous engagements. The battle lasted 12 days, and ended in the defeat that effectively decided the campaign. Montgomery's army broke through the German-Italian line in the north on the 2nd of November, 1942, and Rommel, despite Hitler's explicit order to hold and die in place, began withdrawing his mobile German forces westward, leaving the Italian infantry formations, which lacked motorized transport, to be captured. The retreat that followed covered roughly 2,000 kilometers over the next 3 months, eventually ending at the Mareth line in Tunisia. Bayerlein was throughout this retreat the operational backbone of the command, managing the rearguard actions, coordinating the movements, maintaining enough organizational coherence that the retreat became a fighting withdrawal rather than a rout. When Rommel was finally evacuated from Africa in March of 1943 on grounds of health, and Bayerlein himself left shortly before the final collapse in Tunisia in May, they left behind a campaign that had been lost, but not at the operational level they had managed, lost disgracefully. The professional relationship between Bayerlein and Rommel that developed through 18 months of shared desert experience was one of the most significant personal connections of Bayerlein's life, and its influence extended well beyond the campaign itself. Rommel trusted Bayerlein with a degree of operational autonomy that reflected genuine confidence in the Chief of Staff's judgment. Bayerlein, in turn, developed an understanding of Rommel's operational thinking that was intimate enough to allow him to anticipate rather than merely react. Their correspondence in the post-war years, mediated through Rommel's son Manfred, since Erwin Rommel died in October of 1944, preserved something of the tone of that relationship, a mutual respect between professionals who had shared the particular pressure of managing a campaign at the outer edge of what was logistically possible against opponents who were gradually assembling the resources to make the gap unbridgeable. Chapter 14. The finest blade breaks, Panzer. In the bocage, the word bocage is a French term for a specific kind of agricultural landscape, and in the military literature of Normandy 1944, it has acquired a meaning that goes beyond simple description. It refers to the network of small fields, each enclosed by thick earthwork banks, topped with dense hedgerow vegetation that covers much of the Norman countryside, inland from the beaches. These banks, which in many places were a metre or more in height, rooted over centuries, as solid as masonry, were not features that appeared on German operational maps at the scale used for divisional planning. They were invisible at the level of analysis that determined where the Panzer division would be deployed and what it was expected to accomplish. When the division moved into its positions in the weeks following the 6th of June, 1944, the reality of the bocage confronted German armoured commanders with a problem that had no clean solution: a Panther tank, the Panzer Division's principal battle tank, heavier and more powerfully gunned than almost anything the Allied forces initially fielded, was formidable in open country, capable of engaging at ranges that exceeded most Allied anti-tank weapons. In the bocage, it became something different. The high banks forced tanks to climb them or find gates in the hedgerow lines, exposing the vulnerable underside of the hull during the climb, presenting the belly armor to any anti-tank weapon positioned on the far side. The dense vegetation eliminated long-range observation and engagement. Every field was a potential ambush. Every lane was an avenue down which a soldier with a rocket-propelled anti-tank weapon could approach a tank from cover that was effectively impenetrable to the vehicle's crew. Bayerlein's division spent June fighting this kind of battle along the front south of Bayeux, around Tilly-sur-Seulles, and the approaches to Villers-Bocage. It was attritional fighting of a character that consumed the division's strength without producing the decisive results that the doctrine of armoured warfare had been built around. A panzer division was designed for movement, for exploitation, for the rapid strike that breaks the enemy's coherence before they can respond. In the Bocage, it was being used as expensive defensive infantry, holding ground against an opponent with steadily growing material superiority. The division's tank strength declined week by week, not in the dramatic single-day losses that Operation Cobra would later produce, but in the steady arithmetic of a battle that could not be won by skill or courage, when the underlying material balance was so heavily weighted against it. The counterattack that the division launched on the 10th of July against American infantry formations around Le Desert illustrated the problem with particular clarity. The attack was conducted as doctrine required. Tanks forward, panzer grenadiers in support, the combined arms approach that the division had been built and trained to execute. American anti-tank weapons, specifically the M10 tank destroyers of the supporting American formations, knocked out 30 Panzer-Lehr tanks in a single engagement, forcing the remaining armour to withdraw back across the Via Canal. 30 tanks in a single afternoon. The Panzer-Lehr division, at full strength, had entered Normandy with more tank strength than most German divisions could field. Every loss of this scale brought the division closer to the operational threshold, below which it could no longer function as an armoured formation, and became something more like an improvised infantry unit, with some attached armour, by the 19th of July, the same day that St. El's finally fell to American forces after weeks of grinding advance. The Panzer-Lehr division had roughly 2,200 combat effectives remaining across all its components, with 12 Panzer-Foy tanks and 16 Panther tanks operational. For context, the division had entered Normandy 6 weeks earlier, with more than 10 times that tank strength, and with infantry formations that had not yet been reduced by the constant attrition of Bocage fighting. The division that remained in the line south of St. El on the 19th of July was in name the same formation that had assembled at Nancy in January. Same designation, same commander, same unit traditions, but in operational substance, it had already been transformed by loss into something much thinner and more fragile. The American decision to use strategic bombing as a tactical weapon against the Panzer-Lehr divisions positions was not primarily about the division itself. It was about the stalemate. The Normandy campaign had, by late July of 1944, produced the situation that Allied planners had feared most. A front that was settling into positional warfare, a slow and costly advance through the Bocage that threatened to consume the momentum of the entire operation. The breakout from the beachhead that American planners needed to restore movement. Operation Cobra required breaking the German defensive line, and the line was held at its most critical point by the Panzer-Lehr division. The decision to carpet bomb that division's positions with more than 1,500 heavy bombers was a reflection of how seriously Allied planners took the obstacle the division represented, even in its depleted state. There is a painful irony embedded in that decision. The Panzer-Lehr division, by the 25th of July, was not the formation it had been in June. It had already been ground down to a shadow of its initial strength. The bombing that fell on it that morning was, in terms of force applied relative to target remaining, grossly disproportionate. Not because the American planners were wrong to use it, but because the weeks of Bocage fighting had already accomplished much of the destruction that the bombers were called in to complete. The division that was hit by Operation Cobra's opening bombardment was a formation already fighting well below its authorized strength, defending positions that it lacked the reserves to adjust or reinforce, against an opponent who was still receiving the replacements and supplies that the German logistics system could no longer deliver on the other side of the line. Bayerlein's own account of the 25th of July, given in post-war interviews that formed part of the American Army's historical documentation program, described what the bombardment looked like from inside the target area. The sequence of sound and shock that began in the morning hours and continued through the middle of the day was unlike any previous experience of artillery or air attack, even for men who had been under sustained fire for 6 weeks. The concussive pressure of bombs, detonating in close succession over a wide area, produced physical effects on the human body and on mechanical equipment that ordinary artillery preparation did not. Men were buried alive in collapsed fighting positions. Tanks were flipped or buried by the force of near misses. The noise alone was sufficient to incapacitate men who had no physical wounds. When the American ground assault began following the bombing, the defenders who attempted to resist it were doing so in conditions that had degraded every element of their ability to function as a military unit. Communication was broken at every level. Unit commanders could not locate their men. Men who could be found were often too disoriented to fight effectively. The German artillery that might have slowed or broken up the American advance had been largely destroyed or silenced. The landscape itself had been transformed. The crater fields produced by the bombing eliminated the road network that the defense depended on for the movement of reserves and the resupply of forward positions. On the 27th of July, Bayerlein filed a report with Corps headquarters stating that the Panzer-Lehr division was finally annihilated. The words were not hyperbole. They were an accurate operational assessment from a commander who had been in the business of accurate operational assessment for 6 years. The American breakout that followed, the flood of armor that moved south and then west through the gap that Operation Cobra had blown in the German line, produced within a week a strategic situation that made the losses of the preceding 6 weeks seem, in retrospect, like a prologue. By early August, American armored formations had swept around the German left flank and were driving east toward the Seine, threatening to encircle the entire German position in Normandy. The Falaise Pocket, the catastrophic encirclement that consumed the better part of 2 German armies in August of 1944, was the direct operational consequence of the breakout that the destruction of the Panzer-Lehr division had enabled. Bayerlein's division had, in the most direct tactical sense, been the lock on the door. When it was destroyed, the door came off its hinges. Chapter 15, The Arithmetic of Defeat. Understanding why Germany lost in the West. There is a question that runs through the history of the German army's performance on the Western Front in 1944, and it is a question that Bayerlein, both as a participant and as a post-war analyst, was unusually well positioned to address. The question is this: given the quality of the German soldiers, the capability of German equipment, the operational skill of German commanders at every level from division to army group, why was the outcome so complete? The Panzer-Lehr division at its best was probably the most capable armoured formation in the theatre. It lost anyway. The question of why deserves a more careful answer than simply attributing it to Allied superiority in numbers, because numbers alone do not explain the speed and completeness of the German collapse in the summer of 1944. The answer, worked out over decades of military historical scholarship, and consistent with Bayerlein's own post-war analysis, has several components that interact rather than operating independently. The first is air power. The Allied air forces in the summer of 1944 had achieved a degree of operational control over the battlefield that genuinely had no precedent in the history of warfare at that point. Not just air superiority in the sense of being able to contest the skies. The Luftwaffe had been driven from meaningful daylight presence over Normandy before the invasion even began. What the Allied tactical air forces possessed in June and July of 1944 was something closer to air ownership, the ability to attack anything that moved on the German side of the line. At any time, in any weather that permitted flying, with negligible risk from German air opposition. The consequences of this ran deeper than the direct physical losses from air attack, severe as those were. The knowledge that every movement was potentially observable, that every road column was a potential target, that every daylight concentration of vehicles invited attack, changed the character of German operations in ways that compounded the material losses. It imposed a caution, a dispersal, a preference for night movement that slowed every logistical process, complicated every reinforcement, and created a pervasive operational friction that degraded the performance of even excellent formations. The Panzerlehr Division's losses on its movement to the Normandy front. Vehicles destroyed and personnel killed before a single shot had been fired in the campaign were a direct product of this air environment. Every subsequent day of fighting added to losses that the supply system could not replace because the supply system itself was operating under the same air threat. The second component is logistics, and it is inseparable from the air power question. The German supply chain in the West in 1944 was not merely inadequate in volume, it was being actively destroyed. Allied air forces had spent the months before the invasion systematically attacking rail yards, bridges, road junctions, and marshalling facilities across France and Belgium, in a campaign specifically designed to degrade Germany's ability to move troops and supplies once the invasion began. The effects of this, called the Transportation Plan, had been debated by Allied planners before the invasion, with some arguing that it would not be decisive, and others insisting it would be. By June of 1944, the debate had been settled in favour of the latter view by the simple evidence of what was happening on the ground. German formations were not receiving adequate ammunition. Fuel deliveries were running below operational requirements. Replacement vehicles and spare parts were arriving in quantities that covered a fraction of the losses being sustained. For Bayerlein, who had spent the desert campaign managing supply chains that stretched across the Mediterranean under air and naval interdiction, the logistics environment in Normandy was familiar in its character if extreme in its severity. He understood the relationship between supply and operational capability in the direct terms of a man who had watched a campaign lose its forward momentum when the fuel did not arrive. The difference in Normandy was that the supply deficit was structural rather than episodic. It was not a bad month or a run of unlucky convoy losses, but a systematic and irreversible degradation of the Wehrmacht's ability to sustain its Western forces at a level that could contest Allied material power. By July of 1944, German formations in Normandy were, in a supply sense, losing the battle before any specific tactical engagement began. The third component, and it is one that Bayerlein, in his post-war writings, addressed with a frankness that some of his contemporaries avoided, was the command structure. The German army's tactical and operational performance in Normandy was frequently excellent. Commanders at battalion, regiment, and division level made good decisions under extreme pressure, extracted disproportionate cost from Allied advances, managed their diminishing resources with professional skill. What the German command could not compensate for was the strategic and operational paralysis imposed by the command structure above the army group level. Specifically, the constraints imposed by Hitler's direct intervention in tactical decisions, the withholding and then the belated release of the Panzer reserves on the 6th of June, the insistence on holding positions that should have been evacuated, and the fundamental unwillingness to acknowledge that the battle had turned in a direction that required strategic withdrawal rather than tactical persistence. Bayerlein had lived with the consequences of command interference from above throughout his career. The halt order outside Dunkirk in 1940, Hitler's insistence at El Alamein that Rommel hold a position he knew could not be held, the rigid assignment of the Panzer reserves that meant the Panzerlehr division could not move immediately on the 6th of June. In each case, the decision came from a level of command that was operating on a picture of the battle that was less accurate than the picture possessed by the commanders actually in the field. The system that had produced such rapid operational success in 1939 and 1940, in which bold commanders were given the freedom to act on their own initiative, had by 1944 been partially replaced by a system in which initiative was constrained by the demands of a supreme commander whose grip on operational reality was increasingly uncertain. This analysis is not offered as an excuse for German defeat. The German army in the West in 1944 was fighting in the service of a regime that deserved to lose, and the defeat was right. But the reasons for the defeat are worth understanding with precision because they clarify what Bayerlein was actually experiencing in those summer months. Not simply a military defeat, but a particular kind of defeat produced by the intersection of Allied material superiority, systematic air dominance, and the structural dysfunction of a command system that had already consumed its best operational minds in the service of a strategy that was never sustainable. The Panzerlehr Division's story in Normandy is, from this perspective, not simply the story of a unit that was destroyed. It is the story of the most capable formation the German army could field, applied with professional skill and considerable tactical success, against an opponent that had systematically denied it the conditions under which its capabilities could be decisive. The division did not fail. The system that deployed it, supplied it, and constrained its operational freedom failed. Bayerlein understood this. His post-war accounts make clear that he understood it, even if the framing of those accounts was shaped by the natural desire of any professional soldier to find meaning and competence in his own performance rather than in the larger structural forces that determined the outcome. The lesson that the Normandy campaign inscribed most deeply in Bayerlein's professional understanding, confirmed and reinforced by everything that followed in the Ardennes and the Ruhr, was that modern industrialized warfare at the scale of the Second World War had produced a set of constraints on individual military skill that no amount of operational genius could overcome. Guderian had been right that armoured warfare required audacity and speed. Rommel had been right that personal leadership and tactical creativity could produce results disproportionate to force ratios, but both insights had a boundary condition. They worked when the material balance permitted them to work. When the material balance became as lopsided as it was in the summer of 1944, they became irrelevant. The factories had decided. The production lines had decided. The oil fields and the dockyards and the assembly halls of the opposing industrial systems had made a calculation that no battlefield decision could reverse. Chapter 16. Last Command, the Ruhr Pocket and the Choice to Survive. The Ruhr Valley in the spring of 1945 was a landscape of industrial ruin and human exhaustion that defied easy description. The factories that had made it the economic heart of Germany, the steel mills, the coal mines, the chemical plants, the armaments works, had been the target of Allied strategic bombing for more than 2 years, and by March of 1945, the physical evidence of that sustained attention was everywhere. Blast-damaged buildings, crater fields interrupting road networks, industrial chimneys that had stopped producing smoke because the plants beneath them had stopped functioning, and in the spaces between the ruins, the remnants of German military formations that had been fighting continuously for months, fed into the pocket by the collapse of the Rhine defences, and now caught in an encirclement that was tightening daily. Bayerlein arrived in the Ruhr Pocket as the commanding general of the 53rd Corps, a promotion from divisional command that had come in the final months of the war as the Wehrmacht's senior officers were shuffled and reshuffled by the cascading losses of the final campaigns. The corps he commanded was not the corps of 1942, a headquarters managing multiple fully equipped divisions with adequate staffs and functioning supply chains. It was a collection of formations that had lost so much of their organic strength that the difference between a division and a regiment, between a regiment and a battalion, had become a matter of administrative designation more than operational reality. He was commanding men who were tired in the bone-deep way of soldiers, who have been asking their bodies for more than bodies can give for too long, and who knew, with the clarity that comes when the strategic situation has become undeniable, that the war was over. The encirclement of the Ruhr Pocket was completed in the first days of April 1945, as the 1st and 9th United States Armies linked up at Lippstadt on the 1st of April, an irony of the calendar that was not lost on the German officers who noted it. Inside the pocket, Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B, various corps and division headquarters, supply troops, Luftwaffe ground personnel, the remnants of formations that had been in continuous contact with the enemy since the Ardennes offensive 3 months earlier. The total number trapped was, by any accounting, very large. The estimates of more than 300,000 represent one of the largest encirclements in the war's Western theatre. But unlike the great encirclements of the Eastern Front, Stalingrad, the Korsun Pocket, this one was not producing the kind of sustained defensive effort that might prolong it for months. The German forces in the Ruhr lacked the fuel, the ammunition, and, increasingly, the institutional will to conduct the kind of organized resistance that prolonged encirclement requires. The orders that came down through the chain of command in those final weeks were orders that Bayerlein, and many officers like him, found increasingly difficult to execute in any meaningful sense. Hold this position, counterattack in this sector, deny the enemy this road junction. The orders had the formal character of military commands. They were issued by proper authority, through proper channels, in the proper format. What they lacked was the connection to operational reality that would have given them meaning. Holding positions required ammunition that was not arriving. Counterattacking required fuel that was gone. Denying road junctions required troop concentrations that could not be assembled without inviting the air attacks that would disperse them before they reached their objective. The commands described a war that was no longer the war being fought in the ruins of the Ruhr in April of 1945. The Nero Decree, Hitler's order to destroy everything rather than leave it to the Allies, was the command that most directly confronted Bayerlein and the other officers in the pocket with the moral problem of obedience. The decree was not simply a military order of the kind that any professional soldier might execute as part of his duty. It was an order to destroy the economic and physical foundation of the country, whose people these officers were ostensibly serving. The factories, the bridges, the waterworks, the power plants that the decree targeted were not military installations. They were the infrastructure of ordinary German civilian life. The things that, after the war ended, would be needed to produce food, provide heat, move people, rebuild the cities that had been bombed for years. Destroying them would not meaningfully impede the Allied advance. It would simply make German civilian suffering after the surrender deeper and more prolonged. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, argued against the decree directly with Hitler and then quietly worked to undermine its implementation through the remaining administrative structures of the Reich. Many field commanders did the same thing in their own way, not through formal refusal, which carried mortal risk in an army where officers were still being executed for disobedience or defeatism, but through the quiet failure to transmit orders, the reported impossibility of carrying out demolitions under combat conditions, the convenient absence of the engineering troops needed to execute destructions that were nominally ordered, but practically never attempted. Bayerlein belonged to this informal coalition of quiet non-compliance. The bridges in his sector that could have been demolished were not demolished. The civilian infrastructure that could have been wrecked was not wrecked. Model's dissolution of Army Group B, his final act as a commander, releasing each soldier from his obligation before taking his own life in a forest near Duisburg on the 21st of April, was, in retrospect, an act of institutional mercy for the men he commanded, even as it was an act of personal despair. By dissolving the army group, rather than surrendering it, Model gave his subordinates the formal freedom to make individual decisions about their own fate, without requiring anyone to bear the institutional weight of a formal capitulation. Some men tried to break out of the pocket in small groups and reach American lines in an orderly way. Some simply walked toward the nearest American formation. Some, particularly those with reason to fear what Allied or Soviet captivity might mean for them, attempted to disappear into the civilian population. For Bayerlein, the decision was the soldiers' decision: formal surrender to American forces in the third week of April 1945. The circumstances of that surrender placed him initially in American captivity, along with thousands of other German officers and enlisted men who were being processed by the American Army's prisoner of war system at a scale it had not anticipated needing to manage. He was, in the first days of captivity, one figure in an enormous mass of men: generals, colonels, sergeants, privates, all of them moving through the administrative machinery of a surrender that was still being organized. But his rank and his record meant that he was quickly identified as an intelligence asset, a man whose operational knowledge of the German army from Poland to the Ruhr was worth systematic exploitation. The American officers who debriefed Bayerlein in the weeks and months after his capture were, by most accounts, both thorough and professionally respectful. The relationship between captured professional soldiers and their captors, when both sides shared the framework of military professionalism, had a particular character in the Second World War's Western theatre, different in both tone and consequence from the relationships that governed captivity on the Eastern Front. Bayerlein was asked detailed questions about the campaigns he had participated in, the commanders he had served under, the capabilities and doctrines of the formations he had commanded. He answered. His answers were, in the immediate term, of intelligence value. In the longer term, they became part of the historical record. The physical condition of the men in the Ruhr pocket at the moment of its collapse was a separate issue from the administrative processing of surrender. Weeks of fighting on inadequate food and in deteriorating conditions, in weather that had been cold and wet through much of April, had produced a population of prisoners whose immediate medical needs were considerable. Bayerlein himself, whose health had been compromised since the African campaign by the accumulated effects of disease and physical stress, was not in good condition when he entered captivity. The recovery of adequate food, shelter, and medical attention, even in the imperfect conditions of the initial prisoner enclosures, was, for men in this state, a physical relief that had its own psychological dimension. The immediate future, whatever it held, was at least not going to involve being shelled or bombed. The noise that had been the constant auditory background of 5.5 years of active service was suddenly gone. Chapter 17. What remains? The history Bayerlein left behind. The body of work that Fritz Bayerlein left behind. The operational manuscripts, the interview transcripts, the correspondence, the personal papers that eventually found their way into archives and into the Spade biography constitutes a specific kind of historical legacy. It is not the legacy of a great commander in the traditional sense. Bayerlein did not win a campaign that determined the outcome of the war, did not develop a doctrine that transformed military practice, did not leave behind a body of strategic writing that is taught in war colleges. What he left behind is something more particular, and in its own way, more valuable. The perspective of a man who was present at nearly every significant phase of the German army's Second World War from the inside, who possessed the operational intelligence to understand what he was witnessing, and who survived long enough to record it. The American Army's Foreign Military Studies program. The systematic effort in the post-war years to extract operational knowledge from captured German officers depended on men like Bayerlein for its most valuable material. The program produced hundreds of manuscripts on specific battles, campaigns, and operational problems, written by or drawn from the accounts of German officers who had directed the actions being analysed. Bayerlein contributed to this literature on the North Africa campaign and on the Normandy fighting, and his contributions were valued by the American military historians who worked with them precisely because he had been at operational level in the headquarters where decisions were made, with the analytical capability to explain not just what happened, but why the people involved made the choices they made. The historiography of Rommel, the vast literature that has grown up around the Desert Fox since the war, draws heavily on the accounts of people who worked with him, and Bayerlein is among the most important of those witnesses. His assessments of Rommel's operational style, his strengths and his limitations, his relationship with his staff and his superiors, appear in multiple secondary works and have been cited by historians ranging from Corelli Barnett to David Fraser to Ralph Georg Reuth. The value of this testimony lies not just in its content, but in its position. Bayerlein saw Rommel from the unique vantage point of the Chief of Staff, close enough for daily professional intimacy, but functionally separate enough to maintain some degree of independent perspective. He admired Rommel. He also, in his more candid moments, identified the operational habits that contributed to the campaign's failure. The forward displacement that left the headquarters uncoordinated. The supply neglect that resulted from prioritizing advance over sustainment. The repeated decisions to attack when the arithmetic of the supply situation argued against it. The question of how the Panzer Division's experience in Normandy should be understood. What it tells us about the German army's capabilities and limitations in the final year of the war has been addressed by military historians with varying conclusions. Some accounts, particularly those written in the 2 or 3 decades after the war, drew heavily on German operational accounts, including Bayerlein's, and tended to emphasize the tactical excellence of German formations, while attributing their defeat to Allied material superiority and German strategic dysfunction. Later scholarship, with access to a broader range of sources and a greater willingness to examine the German military's relationship to the regime it served, has produced a more complex picture, one that acknowledges the tactical quality while situating it in the context of a system that was simultaneously militarily capable and morally compromised. Bayerlein's own accounts occupy an uncertain position in this historiographical argument. They are primary sources of genuine value, produced by a man of demonstrated intelligence and operational experience, but shaped by the natural tendencies of any primary source towards self-presentation and selective emphasis. The correspondence that Bayerlein maintained with former comrades and with historians in the years after the war was part of a broader pattern of engagement with the historical record that characterized many senior German officers in the post-war decades. The German Veterans Associations, the regimental histories, the divisional commemorations, all of these created a social world in which the shared experience of the war could be processed and organized into a coherent institutional memory. This world had its own politics, debates about who bore responsibility for specific failures, arguments about the relationship between the professional military and the political direction of the war, the contested memory of individual commanders and individual campaigns. Bayerlein participated in these conversations, sometimes directly and sometimes through his writings, and his contributions shaped how the campaigns he had served in were remembered in German military memory. There is a specific episode that appears in the Spade biography, and that deserves particular attention because it speaks to the human dimension of Bayerlein's post-war life in a way that the operational history does not. The biography records, through the account of his nephew and others who knew him in his final years, that Bayerlein was capable of considerable warmth and personal generosity in his private life, that the man who had commanded armoured formations in some of the most intense fighting of the 20th century was, in the company of people he trusted, gentle and humorous and genuinely interested in the lives of those around him. The detail that Manfred Rommel provided of Bayerlein giving chocolate to children has the quality of a small, specific, unverifiable anecdote that is, precisely because of its smallness and specificity, more revealing than any operational statistic. It suggests a man who was not defined entirely by his military identity, who retained, through everything, some connection to the ordinary human registers of kindness and small generosity. This portrait does not resolve the moral questions that his career raises. It does not answer what he knew, and when, what he could have refused and chose not to, what the full weight of his service to the regime he served actually amounted to. Those questions remain, as they remain for essentially every professional officer of his generation and rank, incompletely answered. What it does suggest is that the person who inhabited the biography, the man who walked the streets of Wardsburg in the 1950s and 60s, who wrote his operational accounts and tended his relationships, and eventually died in January of 1970, was a full human being rather than simply a historical function. He was capable of both the precision of the operational mind that had tracked supply columns across the Libyan desert and the warmth of the grandfather type who gave sweets to neighborhood children. Both of those things were true at the same time, and the difficulty of holding them both in mind simultaneously is not a failure of analysis. It is an accurate reflection of what human beings are. The documentary record of his life, in the archives at Koblenz and Freiburg that hold Wehrmacht files, in the American military archives that hold the debriefing transcripts, in the family collection that Spade accessed for the biography, is more complete than the records of most German officers of his rank and generation. This is partly because he survived, which many did not. It is partly because he was willing to cooperate with historical documentation efforts in the post-war period, which not all survivors were. And it is partly because the specific campaigns he participated in, the North Africa campaign, the Normandy campaign, the Ardennes, are among the most heavily documented operations of the entire war, with primary source material available from both sides that allows the German accounts to be cross-referenced against Allied records in ways that either confirm or complicate specific details. The Würzburg that held him in his final years was Assisi City, rebuilding itself from the destruction of the March 1945 bombing, and the pace of that reconstruction, rapid, determined, the familiar German post-war urgency about getting back to work, meant that by the time Bayerlein died in January of 1970, much of the city's historic character had been restored. The Baroque churches and bridges that had been his childhood landscape were recognizable, again rebuilt with the care that the city's residents had brought to the work of recovery. He had lived long enough to see Wardsburg become, in important respects, itself again. Whether that reconstruction was matched by an equivalent internal reckoning with the war, with the regime, with the full meaning of the service he had given, is a question that the historical record, as honest as it is, cannot fully answer. Chapter 18, The Long View, What Bayerlein's Story Tells Us About War and the Men Who Fight It. We began this documentary more than 3 hours ago with a question about a kind of soldier history tends to misplace. The man between the monument and the paperback, between the general's name, carved in stone, and the private story told in a mass-market memoir. Fritz Bayerlein occupied that middle space for most of the period between his death in January of 1970 and the publication of the Spade biography in the early years of the 21st century. He was not forgotten. Anyone who read seriously in Second World War operational history encountered his name, his role, his accounts. But he was not remembered in the way that the commanders he served under were remembered, and the documentary record of his career was dispersed across multiple archives, multiple languages, multiple campaigns, in a way that made the coherent whole difficult to assemble. What that whole looks like, assembled across the span of this documentary, is a career that was in several important respects unique. Bayerlein served under Guderian and under Rommel, arguably the two most influential German practitioners of armoured warfare in the Second World War. At the operational level, close enough to understand how each of them thought and decided and managed the relationship between their personal instincts and the institutional constraints of military command. He then commanded at divisional and corps level himself, applying what he had learned in contexts that tested it as severely as any operational challenge the German army faced in the war's final years. The range of theatres: Poland, France, Russia, North Africa, Normandy, the Ardennes, the Ruhr, gives his career a breadth that few officers on either side of the war possessed. That breadth makes his career valuable as something more than individual biography. It makes it a guided tour of the German Army's Second World War, a way of following, through one man's experience, the arc from the stunning operational successes of 1939 and 1940, through the slow grinding of the middle years to the collapse of 1944 and 1945. Bayerlein was not responsible for the trajectory of that arc. He was carried by it, contributing his professional skill to each phase, unable to alter the strategic forces that determined where each phase ended. But his presence throughout means that his story can serve as a thread through the entire experience. A single human perspective that, if followed carefully, illuminates the operational logic and the human texture of each campaign in a way that no purely analytical account quite achieves. The question of legacy is complicated for anyone who served in the Wehrmacht, and it is no less complicated for Bayerlein. The German military profession of the Second World War cannot be neatly separated from the regime it served and the crimes that regime committed. The separation that many post-war accounts attempted to draw between the professional soldier doing his duty and the political system that directed where that duty led is not a separation that careful historical analysis sustains. The Wehrmacht was not simply an instrument that could have been used for any purpose. It was shaped by the regime that created it, embedded in the institutional and ideological context of National Socialist Germany, and implicated, to varying degrees, at different levels of the institution, in the wider system of violence and persecution that the regime operated. At the same time, the particular texture of individual careers and individual choices within that system is not well served by treatments that collapse everything into a single undifferentiated condemnation. The post-war generation of German historians who undertook the serious reckoning with the Wehrmacht's record, a project that began slowly in the 1950s and accelerated dramatically from the 1980s onward, arrived at a picture of genuine complexity, an institution capable of both great professional skill and significant complicity in the regime's crimes, with individual variation across a very wide range. Bayerlein occupies a specific position in that range, a professional soldier whose conduct in the campaigns he directed does not appear in the war crimes literature, who quietly declined to execute the most destructive final orders of the regime, who cooperated honestly with the historical documentation of the war, and who nonetheless served the system from its beginning to its end, without the kind of moral rupture that would have required him to refuse that service. What his story asks of us as an audience is something that good history always asks: to resist the simplification that makes the past easier to categorize, but less true to what it actually was. Bayerlein was not a hero in the sense that post-war memory wants its figures of note to be heroes. He was not a villain in the sense that the same memory wants its antagonists to be villains. He was a highly capable professional soldier who made choices within a system that was making catastrophic choices at its highest levels, who contributed his skills to campaigns that were fought in the service of a cause that deserved to fail, and who survived to live a quiet final quarter century in the city where he had been born. The moral weight of that, the question of what it means to have been very good at something that was used in the service of something very bad, is a question that does not resolve cleanly. and that is precisely why it repays. Continued thought. The military dimensions of his career, separated from the moral ones for the purposes of analysis, demonstrate something about the limits of individual excellence in the face of systemic conditions. Bayerlein was genuinely exceptional as an operational staff officer and as a commander. His management of Rommel's headquarters during the Desert Campaign was, by any professional military standard, outstanding work done under extreme conditions. His command of the Panzer Lehr Division, from its formation through its destruction at Operation Cobra, was the work of a general who extracted the maximum possible performance from his formation against opponents who were ultimately too strong to be overcome by performance alone. The lesson that career demonstrates, that individual excellence, however genuine, operates within structural constraints that it cannot individually transcend, is one that military history repeatedly illustrates, and that Bayerlein's career illustrates with particular clarity. The final years of his life, the 1960s, the quiet decline from the physical demands of old age, the Würzburg landscape that had held him from the beginning to the end, are the years about which the historical record is thinnest and the imagination is left most to its own work. He read, he corresponded, he presumably sat sometimes by the main river and watched the boats and the light on the water, and thought about things that no archive contains. He had outlived his century's worst convulsion and been shaped by it in every direction, and whatever he made of that in the privacy of his own mind is beyond recovery now. What remains is the record, the operational analyses, and the interview transcripts, and the family photographs and the letters. And the record is, for a man of his historical position, unusually complete. Fritz Bayerlein died on the 30th of January, 1970. He was 71 years old. He was buried in Würzburg. The city he was buried in was not the city he had left in 1917. It had been rebuilt from its bombed ruins into something that held the shape of the old city, while containing, in its reconstructed facades and repaired bridges, the evidence of everything that had happened in between. It was, in that sense, an appropriate place for a soldier whose own life held the shape of a professional military career, while containing, in its history and its silences, the evidence of a century that had asked more of ordinary human beings than ordinary human beings were designed to give. The war is over. The record remains. And the task of looking at it honestly, without the comfort of simple verdicts, without the relief of clean categories, belongs to the people who come after. That means us. It has always meant us.